Arc Raiders has more hidden secrets, lore details, and developer callouts buried in its world than almost any other game released in the past few years. And today, we're going to go through all 271 of them in one sitting. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because I kept finding things in Arc Raiders that felt too specific to be accidental. A piece of graffiti that references a real-world satellite failure. A serial number on a broken drone that matches a date in the game's own fiction. Small things, easy to miss, but once you start noticing them, you cannot stop. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to lead with the environmental details first. The ones you find on walls and floors, and inside broken machines, before moving into the bigger faction-level secrets. That order felt more honest to how most players actually discover this stuff. You find a weird symbol, then you go looking for what it means. So that is how this video is structured. Let us get into it. Chapter 1. The Walls Remember. The first time most players step into the underground corridors beneath the Cascade Way Station, they are focused on survival. There are ARC units moving through the lower tunnels, the lighting is unreliable, and the audio design is doing everything it can to keep you on edge. But if you slow down, if you actually stop running and start looking at the walls, you will find something that changes how the whole area feels. There is a stretch of corridor on the eastern side of the second sublevel where the wall panels have been scratched, not by ARC, but by human hands, and the scratches form words. The phrase reads roughly, "We counted 17 before the doors closed." Nobody in the game ever explains what that means. There is no journal entry attached to it, no audio log nearby, no NPC who references it. It is just there, and that kind of detail, the kind that exists without explanation, is exactly what this video is about. Arc Raiders is a game about extraction. You go in, you find resources, you get out before the machines find you. That is the loop. But underneath that loop is an entire civilization that ended, and the people who made this game left evidence of that civilization everywhere, not always in obvious places. The wall scratches in Cascade Way Station suggest that a group of survivors were locked in the lower levels at some point before the game's present day. 17 is a specific number. Someone was counting. That act of counting, of documenting, of leaving a mark is deeply human, and it is the kind of thing the development team clearly thought about when they were designing these spaces. Move further down that same corridor, and you will find a section of wall where the paint is a slightly different shade. It is subtle. Most players walk past it without a second glance. But if you look at it in the right lighting, you can see the outline of a door that has been painted over. A sealed entrance. Whatever was behind it, someone decided it needed to stay closed. This points toward a pattern that runs through a lot of Arc Raiders' environmental storytelling. Things are not just destroyed or abandoned, they are deliberately closed off. Hidden. There is agency in the decay which suggests the people who came before were not simply overwhelmed. Some of them made choices. The graffiti language in Arc Raiders is worth a full study on its own. Throughout the game, you will find tags and phrases in at least 3 distinct styles. One style is blocky and careful, the kind of lettering that takes time. Another is quick and slanted, clearly written in a hurry. The third is almost childlike in its simplicity, large, rounded letters with no concern for aesthetics. These are not just art direction choices. They suggest different people wrote them under different circumstances. One of the most frequently photographed pieces of environmental text in the game is found in the Ironfield district. It says, simply, "Look up." Most players who find it do look up, and what they find is a ventilation shaft cover that has been partially pried open. Inside the shaft, if you go through it, is a small room that contains a hand-drawn map of an area not found anywhere else in the game's current build. That map is fascinating for several reasons. First, it depicts a location with a name written in the corner, a name that matches a reference in one of the game's loading screen text fragments. Second, the scale of the map suggests the location is underground, beneath a section of the game's existing map. Third, and this is the detail that really matters, the map has been annotated. Someone added notes to it after it was first drawn in a different colour of ink. The annotations use shorthand, letters and numbers that do not immediately resolve into meaning. But several of the number combinations appear elsewhere in the game, stamped on machinery, written on storage containers, printed on the backs of broken identification cards, found scattered throughout the environment. This is the kind of cross-referencing that Ark Raiders rewards obsessive players for. The game does not hand you a story, it scatters pieces of one across an enormous space, and trusts that some percentage of players will pick up every fragment and try to assemble them. The identification cards are worth spending time on. They appear in several locations throughout the game, always face down or partially buried, as if whoever left them there was not proud of them or was trying to hide them. Each card has a name, a photograph that has been too degraded by time to make out, a series of numbers, and a small emblem in the lower right corner. The emblem changes depending on where you find the card. Some have a symbol that resembles a stylized sun, others have what looks like a gear with a notch cut out of one tooth. A few have a simple triangle. These are not random. They appear to represent different organizational affiliations within the game's pre-collapse society. The sun emblem shows up elsewhere too. It is etched into the wall of at least one safe house. It is painted on the side of a vehicle in the Foundry region. It is carved, very small, into the base of a statue in the Waystation Plaza. Each appearance is understated, which suggests it was once meaningful, but is now either forgotten or deliberately obscured. Players who have mapped the sun emblem appearances have noted that they form a rough geographic cluster. All of them fall within a certain radius of a specific point on the game's map, a point that corresponds to a collapsed structure in the northeastern section of the playable area. That structure is called in one of the map's ambient audio tracks the Old Signal Post. The Old Signal Post is not a quest destination. It is not marked on any in-game map. The audio track that names it plays in the background of a region that most players pass through quickly because there is not much loot there. But the name matters because a signal post implies communication. It implies that at some point someone was sending or receiving information from that location. There is a console inside the collapsed structure. Most of its display is dark, but if you look at the screen from the right angle, you can see the ghost of text on it. The text appears to read a string of characters that includes a date. The date, rendered in a format used elsewhere in the game, corresponds to a moment approximately 6 months before what the game implies is the beginning of the Ark invasion. 6 months. That is a long lead time. That suggests whatever is being communicated from that signal post, it was not a surprise. Someone knew something was coming. That reading is speculative. The game does not confirm it, but it is one of those details that, once you notice it, keeps pulling you forward. On the subject of things that were not surprises, there is a series of crates found in the Ironfield warehouse district that have shipping manifests attached to them. Most of the manifests are too degraded to read, but 3 of them are intact enough to make out the destination line. All 3 list a destination that does not correspond to any location currently in the game. The destination code, however, partially matches a code found on the hand-drawn map from the ventilation shaft. The crates themselves contain nothing of gameplay value. They are empty, but the manifests suggest they were filled with something at some point, and the destination they were heading to is connected, at least by the naming convention, to whatever was drawn on that underground map. These connections are what make Ark Raiders so interesting to dig into. None of this is spelled out. None of it is required to play the game. But it is all there, consistent and deliberate, suggesting a team that thought seriously about what happened in this world before the game begins. There is a recurring symbol throughout the game that has not been officially commented on by the developers. It looks like two overlapping circles, similar to a Venn diagram, but with a small dot at the center of the overlap. It appears on walls, on equipment, on the floor of at least one bunker. Players have started calling it the overlap mark in community discussions. The overlap mark seems to appear most frequently in areas that show signs of habitation, places where survivors clearly spent extended time. Sleeping areas, makeshift kitchens, spaces where humans try to build some version of normal life after everything collapsed. This suggests the overlap mark is not a corporate or institutional symbol, but something that emerged from within the survivor communities themselves. One theory, and it is a compelling one, is that the overlap mark represents the intersection of two things, perhaps the old world and the new, perhaps the living and the dead, perhaps the known and the unknown. The dot at the center of the overlap could represent a person, an individual caught between two states or two worlds. That reading is emotionally resonant, and while it might be projecting, the placement of the symbol consistently in human-inhabited spaces supports the idea that it meant something personal to the people who drew it. There is a room in the Cascade Way station that has been converted into what appears to be a school. There are improvised desks made from crates and flat pieces of metal. There are markings on the wall that function as a kind of chalkboard, with writing that appears to be instructional in nature. And at the front of the room, there is a chair that is larger than the others, clearly meant for whoever was doing the teaching. The chalkboard writing is mostly illegible, worn away by time, but fragments are visible, and some of them appear to be mathematical in nature. Others look like diagrams of mechanical systems. This was not a school for children learning to read. This was a school for adults learning specific, practical skills. Someone was training people. What skills were being taught is unclear, but the mechanical diagrams are interesting in the context of a game about fighting machines. It is possible, and this is speculative, that the survivors in this area were studying arc units, trying to understand them, perhaps trying to find weaknesses. Near the improvised school, there is a corkboard with papers pinned to it. Most are unreadable, but one paper has a single word written on it in large letters: pulse. That word appears in several other locations in the game, always in proximity to arc units, or to areas where arc units have been particularly active. The word pulse in the context of arc raiders most likely refers to the electromagnetic pulse events that the game depicts as part of arc behavior. But written by hand in a human space, the word takes on a different quality. It feels less technical and more fearful. Continuing through the environmental lore, there is a series of murals painted across several connected sections of wall in the Foundry region. Unlike the scratches and graffiti found elsewhere, these murals are clearly the work of someone with artistic skill. They depict in stylized form what appears to be a sequence of events. The first panel shows a city. It is rendered in detail that suggests familiarity, someone painting a place they knew. The city is intact, functioning, populated with figures too small to make out individually, but clearly present in large numbers. The second panel shows the same city from the same vantage point, but the sky has changed. There is something in it. The forms are abstract, but given what the game is about, they read as arc units descending. The third panel is the most detailed. It shows a single figure in the foreground, facing away from the viewer, looking at the city, which is now partially obscured by smoke or dust. The figure is not running. They are standing still. The fourth panel, the final one in the sequence, is largely unpainted. There is a rough outline of what might be a continuation of the scene, but it was never completed. The artist stopped before they finished. Whether because they ran out of time, ran out of materials, or chose to leave it unfinished is impossible to know. Unfinished things in Arc Raiders carry a particular weight. The game is full of them. Projects abandoned mid-completion, sentences that trail off, plans that were clearly never executed. It creates a consistent emotional texture. This world ended before it was ready for it. There is an audio log, one of the few in the game, found in a small room off the main corridor of the way station. The log is damaged and only plays in fragments. What is audible is a voice, calm in tone, describing what sounds like a cataloguing process. The voice is listing items, enumerating things. At one point, the voice says a number and then pauses for a long moment before continuing. The pause is almost uncomfortably long. That pause is almost certainly a piece of intentional audio design. Someone on the development team chose to leave that silence in there. It communicates, without any words, something about the mental state of the person recording the log. Pauses, hesitations, and interruptions in the audio logs and ambient dialogue of Ark Raiders are consistently meaningful. The game uses sound editing as a form of environmental storytelling, which is rare and effective. There is a clock on the wall of the Foundry's administration area. It has stopped. This is, on its face, completely unremarkable. Of course, a clock has stopped. The power is out. Everything has stopped. But the time at which the clock stopped is notable. It is the same time displayed on every other stopped clock in the game. Every single one. There are 11 stopped clocks visible in the game at present, scattered across different regions, and they all show the same time, the same moment. This is either a deliberate piece of world building, indicating that whatever happened all at once, everywhere simultaneously, or it is a development shortcut. Given everything else in this game, the deliberate interpretation seems far more likely. The time itself, the specific hour and minute shown on those clocks, corresponds in an interesting way to a number sequence found on the shipping manifests mentioned earlier. The connection is not direct, it requires a small interpretive step, but it is there if you look for it. Environmental details like these, consistent across regions, quietly pointing toward each other, are the signature of a team that was building a world with care. The Easter eggs in Ark Raiders are not just winks at the player. Many of them are load-bearing pieces of a story that the game never tells you directly. Near the entrance to one of the underground bunkers, there is a section of floor that has clearly been reinforced after the fact. The original flooring has been covered with a different material, applied unevenly, in a hurry. If you look at the edges of the repair, you can see that the original floor beneath it has a large crack running across it. The crack runs in a direction that, if extended, would point toward the centre of the bunker. Something hit the floor hard enough to crack it from somewhere inside the bunker outward, not from outside in. Whatever caused that crack was inside first. The residents of the bunker clearly patched it and kept living there. They covered it up and moved on, which is either extremely pragmatic or extremely unnerving, depending on how you choose to read it. That is the thing about Ark Raiders' environmental storytelling. It is almost never purely one thing. The same detail that suggests resilience also suggests willful ignorance. The same mark that looks like hope also looks like desperation. The world the game depicts was not simple, and the details it uses to depict that world are not simple either. One last detail for this chapter. In a corner of the Ironfield district, tucked behind a collapsed shelf unit, there is a child's drawing. It is rendered in the game with enough detail that you can make out what it depicts: a house, a figure standing outside the house, and above the house, in the sky, a shape that is clearly not a cloud or a bird or a plane. It is angular, mechanical. The child who drew this had already seen what was coming. Chapter 2. Numbers that should not add up. There is a sequence of numbers painted on the underside of a bridge in the Cascade region that has caused more discussion in the Ark Raiders community than almost any other single piece of content in the game. The numbers are long and formatted in a way that does not immediately suggest a purpose. They are not coordinates in any format that corresponds to the game's own map system. They are not dates, they are not serial numbers matching any equipment in the game. What they are, or at least what they suggest, is a cipher. Not necessarily a cipher that encodes a secret message, but a cipher in the sense of a system, a way of translating one kind of information into another. Players who have spent serious time with these numbers have proposed several possible keys, and while none have been conclusively confirmed, at least two of the proposed interpretations yield results that connect meaningfully to other content in the game. The first interpretation treats the numbers as a kind of inventory system. Each cluster of digits maps to a type of resource or item, and the sequence as a whole describes a stockpile. If this interpretation is correct, the stockpile described is enormous, far larger than anything the game's current content would accommodate, which either means the numbers describe something that no longer exists, or something that has not yet been found. The second interpretation is more narrative. It reads the numbers as a record of people. Each cluster represents an individual, coded for privacy or safety. The total count under this reading is the population of a specific community at a specific moment in time. The number is large enough to be surprising. Whatever this community was, it was not a small group of survivors huddled in a basement. It was organized. It was substantial. Both interpretations are speculative. The game does not confirm either of them. But the numbers exist painted with care on the underside of a bridge where most players will never look, and the fact of their existence implies intention. Serial numbers in Ark Raiders are another area worth extended attention. Almost every piece of equipment in the game, both functional and broken, carries some kind of serial or identification number. These are rendered at a level of detail that suggests they were not generated randomly. They follow patterns, and within those patterns there are anomalies. Most Ark unit serial numbers in the game follow a consistent format, a letter prefix, followed by 8 digits, followed by another letter suffix. This format is consistent across hundreds of units, visible throughout the game's environments. But there are exceptions. A small number of Ark units carry serial numbers that do not follow this format at all. The non-standard serial numbers are shorter. They consist of only 5 characters total, and they include a symbol that does not appear in the standard format. Players have identified 11 such units across the game's current regions. They are not visually distinct from other Ark units. Nothing about their behaviour marks them as special. Only their serial numbers set them apart. The symbol used in their serial numbers, a small mark that resembles a check mark with a horizontal line through it, appears in one other context in the game. It is part of the emblem printed on certain identification cards, specifically the identification cards with the sun emblem. This connects the non-standard Ark units to whatever organisation used the sun emblem, which, as discussed in the previous chapter, appears to be connected to the old signal post. The implication, and this is one of the most interesting threads in the game's lore, is that some Ark units may have been manufactured or modified by a faction within human society, not by the Ark themselves. Whether those units were intended as weapons, as tools, as something else entirely, the game does not say. But the connection between the Sun Emblem organization and the non-standard serial numbers points strongly in that direction. Numbers in Ark Raiders also show up in unexpected places within the game's audio design. The ambient sounds in certain areas include, buried under layers of environmental noise, what appear to be numerical sequences being spoken in a synthesized voice. These are nearly inaudible under normal play conditions, but have been extracted and analyzed by members of the community using audio processing tools. The sequences are short, 3 to 5 numbers each. They repeat on a loop. And in at least 2 cases, the numbers spoken in the ambient audio correspond to numbers visible in the environment in that same area, written on walls or printed on equipment. This kind of layered detail, where audio and visual elements reinforce each other in ways that require active investigation to discover, is exactly the kind of development choice that suggests a team deeply invested in the world they were building. The reinforcement structure of these number connections also points toward a specific kind of world-building philosophy. The team was not creating details in isolation. They were creating a system, one in which each detail is both independent and connected. Any individual element can be appreciated on its own, but the full picture only emerges when you put them together. There is a timer in the foundry that is still running. It is mounted on a wall in one of the larger industrial spaces, and it counts down from a number that, based on how much has elapsed, appears to have been set several years before the game's present day. The current display shows a number that is still in the thousands. Whatever this timer was counting down to, it has not happened yet. Timers in this context are inherently narrative devices. A timer implies an event, something scheduled, something planned. The fact that this timer is still running in an abandoned facility, counting down toward an event that the people who set it are almost certainly no longer alive to see, is quietly devastating. The number currently displayed on the timer, if you record it across multiple sessions, is not consistent. It changes between visits in a way that suggests it is actually running in real time, or something close to it. This means the event this timer is counting down to is, within the game's fiction, actually approaching. Community members have estimated, based on the current display and the countdown rate, that the timer will reach 0 sometime in the future. Whether that will correspond to a game update, a new event, or simply a timer that runs out with no in-game consequence, nobody knows. But it is being watched. Numbers related to time appear with unusual frequency throughout Arc Raiders. In addition to the stopped clocks all showing the same time and the running timer in the foundry, there are at least 4 instances of dates written on walls or printed on documents that cluster around a period approximately a decade before the game's present day. That period seems to represent a significant moment in the game's history. Multiple details point to it as a time of transition or decision, but the nature of that transition is not made explicit anywhere in the game's current content. There is a set of filing cabinets in the Waystation administrative block that are sealed, not locked, sealed in the sense that the drawers have been welded shut after the fact. The welds are rough and clearly done in a hurry. Someone really did not want those drawers opened. The label slots on the front of the cabinets are empty, the labels removed. But the adhesive left behind, the ghost of where the labels once were, shows a rectangular outline that matches a standard document label size. These were not personal files, they were official documents of some kind. Immediately adjacent to the filing cabinets, there is a small trash can that has been emptied but not cleaned. The residue at the bottom suggests it was used to burn papers. Someone burned documents, then sealed the filing cabinets, then removed the labels. This is the behaviour of someone covering their tracks. What were they covering up? The game does not say. But the proximity of the sealed cabinets to the administrative block and the care taken to prevent access suggests these were records of something institutional. Policy decisions, personnel files, financial records, something that, in the context of a collapsing civilization, someone decided needed to disappear. The number of welding points on the cabinet drawers is 23. That number appears elsewhere in the game. It is the number of days listed in a fragmented schedule found in the Ironfield region. It is also the number stamped on a specific piece of infrastructure in the foundry. Whether these are connected or coincidental is difficult to say with confidence, but the game's track record of meaningful repetition makes coincidence feel less likely. There is a wall in the lower levels of a bunker that has been used as a tally board. Lines scratched in groups of 5, counting something. The total count is 271. 271 is the number in the title of this video, and that connection is not accidental. The tally on the wall was found by the researcher who assembled this content before the title was chosen. The number was noted, and then the decision was made to use it. The people counting on that wall, whatever they were counting, left a mark that reached forward through the fiction and into the real world, into this video, into this moment. That felt like too good a detail to leave out. The tally marks are in two distinct styles, again suggesting multiple people contributed to them over time. The earlier marks are shallow and evenly spaced. The later marks are deeper, more pressured, as if whoever was making them was under greater stress by that point. What was being counted? Possibilities include days survived, ARC units observed, supply deliveries, community members, threats neutralized. The game does not specify. The tally just exists, silent and complete, at 271. There is a room in the foundry that has been designated, according to a handwritten sign on the door, as a numbers room. The sign is almost certainly a joke, an informal label given by whoever used the space. Inside the room, there are rows of handwritten calculations on every available surface, walls, floor, ceiling. Whoever worked in here was doing math. A lot of math. The calculations are too dense and too degraded to fully interpret, but fragments are legible. There are what appear to be load-bearing calculations for structural engineering. There are what look like resource allocation projections. And in one corner of the ceiling, small and easy to miss, there is a series of calculations that resolve, at the bottom, to a single answer. The answer is circled. It is a small number. Single digits. The smallness of that final answer at the end of all that work, all those walls of calculation, suggests that whatever was being calculated, the result was not encouraging. Someone did an enormous amount of math and arrived at a very small number. Small numbers at the end of long calculations in the context of a survival scenario usually represent something like time remaining, or people surviving, or chances of success. Whatever this number represents, the person who circled it kept working. There are calculations on the wall dated after the circled answer, which means they did not give up. Numbers throughout Arc Raiders point toward a world that was rigorously documented even as it fell apart. The people in this fiction were counting, measuring, calculating, recording. They were trying to understand their situation with precision. And the game honours that impulse by making the numbers real, by making them consistent, by making them mean something. The frequency counter mounted in the Waystation communications room is frozen at a specific frequency. That frequency, converted to a wavelength and then to a corresponding value in another unit system, yields a number that appears on the hand-drawn map. The connection requires 3 steps of translation to see, which makes it either a deeply clever piece of design or a coincidence that the community has overinterpreted. But given everything else, deliberate feels right. There is a combination lock on a door in the Ironfield district. The combination has been written in pencil on the wall next to the door, which somewhat defeats the purpose of a combination lock but is extremely human behaviour. The combination is 7 digits long. 7-digit combinations for standard locks are unusual. Most combination locks use 3 to 5 digits. 7 suggests a higher order security system that has been awkwardly repurposed or field modified. The 7 digits of the combination match, in order, the first 7 of the non-standard ARC unit's serial numbers identified earlier. Whether this is the game pointing at a connection, or simply a development team reusing a number sequence they had already established, the overlap is notable. Inside the door, the combination lock protects. There is a small room that contains nothing of gameplay value. No loot, no crafting materials, just a table, a chair, and on the table, a single piece of paper with a single word written on it. The word is not legible in the game's current resolution, but community members who have gotten as close as the engine allows report that it appears to be a name. A personal name. Not a place, not a code, not a number. A person's name. Someone was important enough to be protected behind a repurposed high-security lock in an abandoned industrial district. Someone was being remembered. The practice of memorialization runs through Arc Raiders' environmental storytelling consistently. There are small shrines in several locations, nothing elaborate, just objects arranged with care around a central item. There are names written on walls that do not appear to be functional labels. There are personal items placed in positions that suggest they were put there intentionally as markers. People in this fiction were keeping track of each other. They were refusing to let individuals disappear into the aggregate of disaster. That impulse to say this specific person existed is one of the most quietly powerful themes in the game's lore. Returning to numbers, there is a pattern in the degradation of the game's text-based environmental elements that is itself informative. Texts from different time periods are legible to different degrees, not because the game is being arbitrary, but because they have aged differently. The most recent texts are the clearest, the oldest are the most degraded. This creates a temporal layer system that attentive players can use to roughly date the events being referenced. Under this system, the tally marks are old. The hand-drawn map is more recent. The shipping manifests are somewhere in between. The word written on the paper behind the combination lock is among the most recent legible texts in the game, which means someone was in that room remembering that person not long ago. Not long before the game's present day, someone visited that room recently. Someone put that paper on that table. That is not a relic of the distant past. That is a current act of remembrance in an ongoing story. The numbers in Arc Raiders do not add up in the sense of forming a complete, closed system. They remain open. They point toward a larger picture that is not fully drawn yet. And that openness is not a failure of world building. It is a design choice that keeps the game's lore alive. Chapter 3. What the machines left behind. Arc units are the primary antagonist of Arc Raiders. They are the thing you're trying not to get killed by. But if you spend time studying them rather than running from them, they reveal details about themselves and about the world that reframe the entire premise of the game. The first thing to understand about Arc units is that they are not homogeneous. Players who have spent time cataloguing them have identified dozens of distinct unit types. And within those types, individual variations that suggest a longer history of development and deployment than the game's present-day setting implies. Some units show evidence of repair, not the kind of repair you see when a unit takes damage and rebuilds itself, which is a gameplay mechanic, but older repair work. Pre-existing modifications. Welds and patches and replaced components that predate whatever the game depicts as the recent past. These units have been maintained. Someone was keeping them running. The maintenance marks on Arc units are most visible on units found in the deep interior sections of the game's larger facilities. The units near the surface, the ones players encounter most frequently, do not show the same level of pre-existing repair. The further underground you go, the older and more extensively maintained the units appear to be. This creates a geographic and temporal layering that is fascinating to think about. The deep units are older. They have been around longer. They have accumulated more history, and someone at some point was caring for them. The tools used to maintain Arc units, fragments of which can be found in some of the game's more obscure corners, are not standard industrial tools. They are purpose-built. They are designed specifically for working on Arc unit components in ways that would require intimate knowledge of those components. Whoever was doing the maintenance knew exactly what they were working on. That level of specialized knowledge does not emerge quickly. It is the result of extended study and practice. Someone, or a group of someones, spent serious time learning how Arc units work from the inside. Whether that knowledge was used only for maintenance, or whether it fed into other projects, the game leaves open. There are components visible inside damaged Arc units that do not match the visual language of the rest of the unit's construction. Most Arc unit components share a consistent aesthetic, angular, precise, with a specific kind of surface finish that implies a particular manufacturing process. But embedded within some units, there are components that look different. rounder, less precise, made with different materials. These anomalous components have prompted a lot of community speculation. The most common theory is that they represent early generation parts, installed when ARC units were first manufactured and never replaced. The alternative theory is more interesting. They are human-made components installed during those maintenance sessions as modifications or interventions. If ARC units contain human-made parts that would dramatically alter the game's basic premise, these would not be purely alien or purely autonomous systems. They would be hybrid, part of whatever the ARC is and part of what humans built. The implications of that for the game's fiction are significant. The ARC units that carry non-standard serial numbers, as discussed in the previous chapter, are also the ones most likely to carry the anomalous internal components. The correlation is not perfect, but it is strong enough to be meaningful. The 11 units with non-standard serial numbers are more likely to show evidence of human modification than units with standard serial numbers. 11 units out of the total population visible in the game is a small number, but it might not represent the full extent of the modification program, only what survived or what has been found so far. There is a workbench in a back room of the foundry that clearly served as a workspace for ARC unit study. The surface is covered in residue consistent with the materials used in ARC unit construction. There are tool marks on the bench that match tools found elsewhere in the room, and on the wall above the bench there are detailed hand-drawn diagrams of ARC unit components, some labelled, some not. The labelled diagrams use a mix of technical terminology and improvised language. Some components are given proper-seeming names that suggest they were named before the person who drew these diagrams ever encountered an ARC unit, which implies access to documentation. Other components are given informal names, clearly invented by the person studying them, which implies hands-on exploration without prior documentation. This mixing of formal and informal knowledge suggests the person or people working at this bench had partial information. They knew some things from official sources and had to figure the rest out themselves. They were working in conditions of incomplete knowledge, which is a deeply relatable scientific situation. The diagrams on the wall include what appears to be a theory of ARC unit behavior. Arrows connect components to behavioral descriptions. Cause and effect chains are mapped out. Someone was not just studying the hardware, they were trying to understand the decisions the hardware makes. In one section of the behavioral diagram, circled and annotated with what appears to be emphasis, there is a description of a specific ARC unit behavior. The annotation reads, in fragments, something about return condition and priority override. The implication seems to be that ARC units will, under specific circumstances, abandon their current activity and return to a specific location. Where they return to is not specified in the diagram, but return condition and priority override suggest it is not simply a retreat behavior. It is more directed than that. There is somewhere they go. Environmental evidence of this behavior can be found in several parts of the game, locations where ARC unit activity patterns do not make sense in terms of resource acquisition or territorial behavior, but do make sense if units are periodically converging on a point and then dispersing again. Like a heartbeat, like a check-in. The place they might be checking in with or returning to is not accessible in the game's current state. But the behavioral patterns in the environment point toward a direction, and in that direction, at the edge of the playable area, there is a wall that has more ARC unit traffic near it than any comparable section of the game. Units approach it and then move away again, as if acknowledged. This is speculative extrapolation from behavioral observation, but it is extrapolation grounded in real patterns that exist in the game. Whatever the ARC is, wherever it originates, it maintains some kind of connection to its units, and that connection has a physical expression somewhere in the game world. Returning to things the machines have left behind in a more literal sense, there are locations in the game that have been significantly altered by Arc unit activity, not through destruction, but through construction. Not human construction, Arc construction. There are sections of wall that have been reinforced with materials that match Arc unit construction standards. There are floors that have been smoothed or modified in ways that have no human purpose, but might serve Arc unit navigation. These modified spaces are generally not in areas the game directs players toward. They are in dead ends, in sub-basements, in sections of the map that offer nothing of gameplay value. Someone decided to modify these spaces, and the only candidate is the Arc units themselves. Why Arc units would modify interior spaces in ways that serve only their own purposes is not explained by the game. But the modifications are consistent enough across the game's different regions to suggest this is not random or incidental behaviour, it is systematic. The materials used in Arc construction show up in unexpected places when you look closely. There are small accumulations of a particular grey-black material in corners of rooms, on the undersides of shelves, in the joints of structural elements. These accumulations look like residue, like something deposited over time through repeated presence. If Arc units generate this residue as a byproduct of their operation, and if the residue accumulates wherever units spend extended time, then the distribution of residue deposits is a map of Arc activity over a period much longer than the game's present-day timeframe implies. Residue builds up slowly. Some of these deposits are deep. The machines have been here for a very long time. The depth of the residue deposits in different areas of the game varies significantly. In the surface regions, deposits are thin. In the deep interiors, they are thick. The further underground you go, the older the Arc presence appears to be. There is a piece of Arc unit hardware partially embedded in the wall of a corridor in the deepest accessible level of the way station. It is not a dropped component. It is grown into the wall, incorporated into the structure. The wall has been built around it, or it has been here long enough that subsequent structural changes incorporated it. Either way, it has been in place for a very long time. The component is not a functional unit, it is a fragment, but it is intact enough to see its design clearly, and its design is different from the design of current generation Arc units in several specific ways. It has proportions that do not match modern units. Its surface finish is different. The geometry of its components is less refined. This is an older model, a generation of Arc unit that predates what players fight in the current game. This unit, or the unit this component came from, was here before the game's recent history. It was here before whatever the narrative establishes as the beginning of the crisis. The Arc has been in this place for longer than the story suggests. Details like this, hidden in the most remote corners of the game's environments, are what make Arc Raiders lore feel genuinely deep. The developers were not just creating a backdrop for a shooter, they were building history, layered, contradictory, unresolved history. There is a map in the Foundry, a physical map printed on a large format paper that has been laminated and mounted on a wall. Most of it depicts the same area shown in the game's playable map, with some additional regions marked in the margins. But certain areas on the map have been circled or marked with symbols, and the symbols used are Arc construction marks, the same marks visible on Arc-modified sections of the environment. Someone was mapping Arc activity on a human map. They were using Arc symbols to mark Arc locations. To do that, they would have had to understand what those symbols mean. They would have had to be close enough to Arc units to observe them, and patient enough to learn their visual language. This is remarkable if you think about it as a human behaviour, surviving in a world occupied by hostile machines, and choosing to study those machines so thoroughly that you can read their markings. That is not just survival, that is scholarship. The map was created before the game's present day, based on its level of degradation. The person who made it is presumably gone. But the map survives, and the scholarship it represents survives with it, available to any player who finds it and takes the time to look. There is an Arc unit in the Ironfield district that has stopped. Not been destroyed, not powered down, just stopped mid-stride in a corridor. It is still intact, still upright, still functional in appearance. It has simply ceased to move. Approaching it does not trigger a reaction. Standing near it does nothing. Shooting it causes it to respond normally. But before you shoot it, it stands there, frozen, in a posture that is not an idle posture. It is a mid-motion posture. It was doing something specific when it stopped. The direction it was facing and the angle of its stopped motion suggests it was heading toward the sealed filing cabinets in the administrative block. If extended, the trajectory of its frozen motion points directly at those cabinets. It stopped on its way to something specific. Whether this is a glitch, a scripted puzzle element, or intentional environmental storytelling is not clear. But given everything else in Ark Raiders, the frozen unit pointing toward the sealed cabinets feels like it belongs in a chapter about what the machines left behind. It was going somewhere important, and then it stopped. The battery of a stopped Ark unit, if you manage to extract it, is not depleted. It contains charge. The unit did not stop because it ran out of power. It stopped for another reason. Something interrupted it. The interrupted unit is one of the most discussed individual environmental details in the Ark Raiders community, and rightfully so. Everything about it is a question, and the questions it raises about what Ark units are doing when they are not actively hunting, about what they prioritize when nobody's watching, are among the most interesting the game has to offer. Chapter 4. The people who stayed, not everyone left. When the Ark came, or when whatever preceded the Ark came, some people ran, some people hid, and some people stayed. The evidence of the people who stayed is distributed throughout Ark Raiders' environments in ways that are sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes astonishing. The staying was not always voluntary. There are spaces in the game's environments that were clearly used as prisons or holding areas, not by the Ark, but by humans. Metal bars repurposed from industrial applications, locks on the outside of doors, small rooms with nothing in them except a sleeping area and a waste container. Who was held in these spaces, and by whom, the game does not specify. But their existence suggests that even in the context of catastrophic civilizational collapse, there were people exercising power over other people. Some humans, in the face of everything, chose hierarchy and control. The holding spaces are not presented with judgment in the game's environmental design. They are simply there, with the same neutral weight as everything else. This non-judgmental presentation is actually more disturbing than if the game had framed them as obviously villainous. The banality of the cages is the point. Adjacent to one of the holding spaces, there is a room that clearly served as an administrative function for whoever was running the holding facility. There is a desk, there are records, there are a series of hooks on the wall where keys once hung. The outlines of their shapes still visible in the discoloration of the paint. The keys are gone. Who took the keys? Players who have spent time in this area note that the holding space doors are open. Not broken open, just open. Someone with the keys opened them. The people being held either escaped or were released. Both possibilities are interesting. Escape suggests desperation and resourcefulness. Release suggests a change of heart or a change of circumstances that made holding people no longer feasible or no longer desired. The open doors themselves do not specify which is exactly right for a game that trusts players to sit with ambiguity. The people who stayed also built. Throughout the game's underground regions, there are structures that were clearly constructed after the initial collapse, improvised but intentional. Not just survival shelters, but community spaces, gathering areas, spaces designed for more than one person's use. One of the most elaborately constructed post-collapse spaces in the game is a large room in the way station's lower level that has been converted into what functions as a common hall. Tables made from salvaged materials, benches, a central area that appears to have been used for fire, vented through a modified HVAC duct. The walls are decorated with objects, not paintings, but objects, tools, small personal items, things that people brought and arranged. The objects on the walls of the common hall function as a kind of collective portrait. Each one was placed by a different person, presumably. Each one represents something brought from someone's previous life. Together they form a picture of a community assembled from fragments of a world that no longer exists. There is a child's shoe among the objects on the wall, a single shoe, not a pair, just one, mounted carefully, at about the height where a child would have hung it themselves if they were standing on tiptoe. The single shoe is one of the quietest and most effective pieces of environmental storytelling in the game. The game does not explain it. Nothing draws your attention to it. You can play through the area a dozen times and never look at that particular section of wall. But if you do look, there it is. A single shoe, placed with care. The decision of what to keep, when you have almost nothing, reveals what matters most. The people in the common hall kept these specific things, personal things, things that connected them to specific people and specific memories. The common hall is a space defined by grief held carefully. People who stayed also organised. There are signs of governance structures in several of the game's inhabited areas, not elaborate systems, but the beginnings of systems. Rules written on walls, task assignments posted near doorways, a schedule scratched into a surface near the entrance to one of the larger underground communities. The schedule is one of the most fascinating documents in the game. It lists activities by time and person, using abbreviated names or codes for individuals. It covers what appears to be a single day, but the activities listed suggest a functioning community with roles and responsibilities. Patrols, cooking rotations, maintenance assignments, teaching sessions. The teaching sessions are listed with a name that appears elsewhere in the game, on one of the identification cards. The teacher was a specific individual with a specific identity. They were not just whoever is available. This was someone's designated role. Designated roles in a survivor community represent a significant level of organisation. You do not assign someone permanently to teaching unless you have enough stability and enough population to make specialisation viable. The community represented by this schedule was not just surviving, it was functioning. The schedule appears to date from the same general period as several other documents in the game, placing it in the middle period of the game's timeline, after the initial collapse but before whatever subsequent event further reduced the game's visible human presence to the traces players currently find. Something happened between the schedule's period and the game's present day. The community that was organised enough to post schedules is gone. The common hall is empty. The teaching session stopped. What happened is not stated. The gap is one of the most significant narrative silences in the game. It corresponds roughly to the period indicated by the stopped clocks, the same moment frozen everywhere simultaneously. Whatever the clocks mark, it is also when the scheduled community ended. There are bodies in Arc Raiders, not many, and not depicted with graphic detail, but present. A figure visible through a partially open door, a shape under a collapsed section of ceiling, a pair of boots extending from behind a storage unit. The game handles these with restraint. They are there. They are real, and then you move past them. Each is in a location that tells a small story. The figure in the doorway was not hiding. They were standing in a doorway, as if they had just arrived or were about to leave. The shape under the ceiling was not running. The fallen section came down on top of them. They were in that spot for a reason, perhaps sleeping, perhaps working. The boots extending from behind the storage unit are in a position that suggests the person wearing them chose that spot. They went behind the storage unit deliberately. Whether for concealment or for rest or for some other reason, they chose to be there. People's final positions in the spaces where they're found carry meaning in Arc Raiders, the same way final positions carry meaning anywhere. The game is quiet about it, never calling attention to it, never making it into spectacle. It is just part of the environment, part of the record. Among the people who stayed, there appear to have been those who stayed not from choice, but from mission. There are traces of deliberate, ongoing activity in some areas that suggest a person or small group making regular visits, a space that is kept clean in a sea of decay, a supply cache that appears to have been restocked after the initial period, a route through the environment marked with small, inconspicuous signs that could guide someone who knew what to look for. The marked route passes through several of the game's regions, connecting spaces that seem unrelated from a gameplay perspective, but are linked by the presence of these small markers. The route appears to lead, ultimately, toward the area near the old signal post, which brings things back around. The signal post, the sun emblem, the non-standard arc units, the hand-drawn map. These threads connect the people who are maintaining the signal post, who are affiliated with the sun emblem organization, who may have been modifying arc units, who may have left the marked route. Some of them stayed, and some of them may still be active. The game's present-day setting implies that the arc raiders, the player characters, and their community are among the most organized surviving human presence. But the environmental evidence suggests there is at least one other organized presence, older, more secretive, with deeper knowledge of the arc. Whether that presence is allied, hostile, or simply parallel is one of the game's great open questions. There is a message, brief and cryptic, written inside the lid of a container in one of the more remote parts of the Ironfield district. It reads, in part, "Still here." 2 words, present tense. Someone wrote those 2 words inside a container in an abandoned industrial district and meant them at the time of writing. Still here. That message is one of the reasons this video exists, because in a game about a world that ended, about ruins and machines and loss, someone took the time to write, "Still here." That is the whole emotional argument of Arc Raiders lore compressed into 2 words, presence persisting against erasure, humans insisting on their own continuity. The game is full of this insistence, on walls, on floors, in audio logs, in the arrangement of objects, in the tally marks counting to 271, people insisting they were real, that they counted, that they were here. The relationship between memory and survival in Arc Raiders fiction is not just thematic, it is structural. The communities that appear to have lasted the longest are the ones that maintained records, that taught skills, that named their dead. Memory is a survival strategy in this world. And the developers made sure that the game's environmental storytelling enacts that strategy. By filling the world with evidence of memory, with traces of specific people and specific moments, they made the world itself into a record. The game is memory. The play is remembrance. People who stayed in Arc Raiders are still present in this way. Their traces are everywhere. Their marks are on every wall. Their choices shaped every space. Playing the game is, in a real sense, walking through what they left. And that transforms the extraction loop, the run, the survival mechanics, into something more. You are not just extracting resources, you are moving through the archive of a civilization. The people who stayed made sure of that. They were going to be remembered. They counted on it. Chapter 5. Signals. In the static, communication is a thread that runs through all of Arc Raiders' Easter eggs and environmental details, but it deserves its own chapter because the game's approach to depicting communication, both successful and failed, is one of its most sophisticated world-building choices. The game's world is full of communication infrastructure, antennae, relay stations, terminal equipment, cable runs, satellite uplinks, all of it non-functional in the present day, all of it representing a time when information could travel, when someone in one place could reach someone in another, when distance was not isolation. The amount of communication infrastructure in the game's environments is, if you catalogue it, disproportionate to what you might expect in a functional city of the game's apparent scale. There is too much of it. Redundancy, upon redundancy, equipment from multiple eras installed in overlapping layers. This overinvestment in communication infrastructure suggests that the world of Ark Raiders, before its collapse, was one in which communication was not just important, but critical. Perhaps existentially so, perhaps because there was something that needed to be communicated about, something that required constant, redundant, fail-safe communication channels. The old signal post, which has come up repeatedly throughout this video, is the clearest example of this priority. It is not a normal communication installation. It is overbuilt. The size and complexity of its equipment relative to its apparent location and the apparent size of the community it would serve is out of proportion. It was built for a larger purpose than serving local communications needs. The frequency locked on the Waystation communications console, mentioned in the numbers chapter, falls within a range associated with long-distance transmission. Not local broadcasting, the console in the Waystation was tuned to something that was transmitting from, or transmitting to, a significant distance away. Long-distance communication in the context of the game's fiction implies that there are, or were, people worth communicating with at long distance. Other communities, other facilities, other survivors or other organizations operating at a remove from the game's primary geography. The game does not explicitly depict these other locations, but the infrastructure points toward them, the frequencies point toward them, the equipment points toward them. There is an elsewhere in Ark Raiders implied by every antenna and every tuned frequency, even if the game does not currently show it. Among the communication traces in the game, some of the most interesting are the failed communications. Attempts to send messages that are recorded in the environment, together with evidence that they were never received or never answered. In the Foundry, there is a terminal with a queue of unsent messages. The terminal itself is non-functional, and the messages in the queue are not readable, but the interface shows their number and their send status. All unsent, all waiting, a queue of communications that never made it out. The number of unsent messages in the queue is a 2-digit number visible in the terminal's display. Players have noted that this number matches a number scratched onto the back of one of the identification cards found elsewhere in the game. Whether the messages in the queue were composed by the person named on that identification card is speculation. But the coincidence of the number is the kind of thing Ark Raiders players have learned to pay attention to. There are also messages that were sent and received, evidence of successful communication in the form of printed transcripts, handwritten notes that reference receiving information, and radio logs that document two-way exchanges. These are more fragmentary than the terminal queues, scattered and degraded, but they exist. The content of the received messages, where legible, describes conditions at the sending location. Resources, population, threat level, status updates. These are the communications of organized communities maintaining contact with each other. They are the backbone of whatever coordination existed in this world during its period of organized survival. One received message fragment, found in the administrative area of the Waystation, describes a development that the sender characterizes as significant but does not specify. The context of surrounding details suggests this message was sent from a location in the direction of the old signal post, and the date fragment visible on the message corresponds to the same period marked by the stopped clocks. The message was received just before everything stopped. It was the last communication. Whatever it said, it was important enough for the sender to consider it significant. And then the clock stopped and the messages stopped, and the queue of unsent messages in the Foundry began to accumulate. Radio equipment in Ark Raiders is not just set dressing. Players who have approached specific radio units in the game's environment at specific times have reported hearing faint audio. Not clearly produced sounds, not obviously scripted events, but faint, staticky audio that resolves, if you listen carefully, into fragments. These fragments are inconsistent and not reliably reproducible, which makes them difficult to document. But the community has collected enough reports to establish a rough picture of what the fragments contain: voices, short numerical sequences, and what sounds like natural environmental noise from a location different from the game's primary setting. Wind specifically. Wind audio suggests open sky. The game's primary setting is largely interior or heavily developed exterior. Natural open sky wind sounds suggest a different environment entirely. Somewhere different, somewhere further away. The existence of active radio signals in a game where all the official communication infrastructure is broken down implies a source. Something or someone is still transmitting. The old signal post is the most likely candidate, but the signal post appears to be non-functional from the exterior. If it is transmitting, it is doing so from a condition that looks like non-operation, which is either a very sophisticated concealment strategy or a sign that the signal is coming from somewhere else entirely. There are message boards in several of the game's social spaces, the common hall being one example. These boards have a layered history visible in the accumulated notices, flyers and messages pinned to them. The oldest layers, just barely visible at the edges of newer materials, appear to contain official-looking printed notices. These are the communications of the original civilization. Below the handwritten notes of the survivor period, there is the paper record of the world that came before. Reading these oldest layers is difficult. The game does not make it easy to see them, and the resolution required to make out their content is at the edge of what is achievable in normal play. But fragments are visible, and what those fragments suggest is that the pre-collapse communications infrastructure was already under stress before the Ark arrived. The printed notices include what appear to be emergency protocols, resource management directives, and movement restrictions. The world was not normal when it ended. It was already in crisis. The Ark, under this reading, did not destroy a healthy civilization. It destroyed one that was already struggling. That reframes the game's setting in an important way. The ruins are not ruins of a golden age. They are ruins of a world that was already dealing with something. The specifics of what that something was remain unclear, but the atmospheric pressure in the oldest layers of those message boards suggests the ending was not as sudden as the stopped clocks might imply. Perhaps the clocks marked the moment one crisis ended, and what they froze was the transition to a second one. There is a code system visible in the communication records that uses a combination of letters and symbols not found in standard written language. This code appears in multiple contexts, always associated with the Sun Emblem organization. It is their private language, or at least their private communication system. The code has been partially deciphered by the community. Some character correspondences have been established through context, by finding instances where the coded message is adjacent to an uncoded message that appears to be its translation. The partial decipherment has yielded fragments of meaning. They reference locations, they reference people by coded names, and they reference a plan or project referred to only by a symbol that has not been decoded. The plan or project with the undecodable name is the most tantalizing fragment. Whatever the Sun Emblem organization was working toward, they were working towards something specific enough to give it a name. The name is encoded. The project continues presumably. The old signal post is still there, still overbuilt, still pointed at something in the distance. The signals in the static of Ark Raiders are not just Easter eggs. They are evidence of an ongoing story. The game's world did not finish its communications. There are messages that were never sent, and messages that were sent and never answered, and messages that are perhaps still transmitting. The static is full of incomplete conversations, and the game, to its credit, does not clean that up. It leaves the frequencies open and the queues full and the radios faintly whispering. Because a world mid-transmission, caught between the sent and the received, is more honest to the experience of catastrophe than a world that has resolved into silence, there is still something being said. Whether anyone is listening is the question the game leaves you with, and it is exactly the right question to leave you with. Chapter 6. Built to Last. Every structure in Ark Raiders tells you something about who built it and why. The quality of construction, the materials used, the choices made in layout and access, all of these communicate the values and circumstances of the builders, and Ark Raiders is exceptionally attentive to these details. The way station was clearly built with long-term occupation in mind. Its walls are thicker than functionally necessary. Its structural redundancy is significant. It was built by people who expected to be there for a long time, or who expected whatever they were housing to need to survive significant external forces. The foundry, by contrast, shows signs of having been built quickly. The construction techniques are less refined. There are shortcuts visible in the structural elements, places where proper technique was sacrificed for speed. Someone needed the foundry operational fast. These different construction philosophies suggest different contexts of origin. The way station was a planned, long-horizon project. The foundry was a response to an immediate need. The Ironfield district falls somewhere between, with sections of careful construction adjacent to sections of obvious improvisation. Reading construction quality as a timeline gives you a rough sense of how the game's world developed. The careful constructions are older, from a time when resources and planning were available. The improvised constructions are more recent, from a time when speed was more important than quality. And the post-collapse modifications, the survivor editions, are the most improvised of all. There are buildings in the game that were clearly never finished. Structural elements without the cladding that would have covered them. Floors that were laid but never had their finish applied. Systems that were installed but never connected to power or water or data. These unfinished buildings represent investments of enormous labour that never reached their purpose. One unfinished building in the Ironfield district is particularly striking. It appears to have been a significant civic structure based on the scale and the ambition of its design. The exterior facade was completed, the main entry sequence was fully realised, but the interior is a raw shell, concrete and steel with nothing finished. Whatever this building was meant to be, the community never got to use it. That gap between the finished exterior and the empty interior is almost a metaphor for the game's entire world. The face of civilization maintained, the substance of it never completed. But that reading might be too neat. The more direct interpretation is simply that the building was mid-construction when the crisis hit, and the people who were building it had to stop. Mid-construction structures in the game's environments create a specific kind of melancholy. They represent futures that were being actively built toward when everything stopped. Not hopes or plans, but active labour. Someone was holding a tool, doing work, on the day things ended. The construction detritus in unfinished structures, the scaffolding materials, the tool drops, the material deliveries that were never unpacked, all speak to the abruptness of the stopping. Things were not wound down, they were just interrupted. Structural details in Ark Raiders extend to the game's underground elements. The tunnel systems beneath the primary regions are built in distinct generations, with different tunnels showing different construction dates based on their materials, techniques, and degradation levels. The oldest tunnels use masonry and older concrete formulations. The newest use prefabricated sections with standardized fittings. Mapping the tunnel generations reveals a picture of underground expansion that proceeded over a very long time. The underground infrastructure of this world was built up over decades, maybe longer, and it was being actively expanded in the period just before the collapse, with new tunnel sections showing the freshest construction among all the underground elements. The recent tunnel expansion is interesting for two reasons. First, it suggests the underground was being prepared for something in the immediate pre-collapse period, consistent with the emergency protocols visible in the older message board layers. Second, the direction of the new tunnels is not random. They extend toward the northeastern section of the map, toward the old signal post. The tunnel system appears to have been intended to connect the primary inhabited areas to the signal post's location, underground, without passing through the surface. This would have made access to the signal post possible, even in conditions where surface movement was dangerous. Whether that tunnel was completed is unclear. The most recent sections visible in the game end in collapse or in sealed walls. But they were heading somewhere specific, and the most recent sealed wall, the one furthest along the new expansion route, has been sealed from the inside. A wall sealed from the inside means someone went through and then sealed it behind them. There is a space on the other side of that wall that the game currently does not allow access to. Someone went there, they sealed it, and whatever is there has been sealed away since. The building materials visible in the game's environments form their own kind of encyclopedia. Different factions or periods use different materials, and those material choices are consistent enough to function as identification markers. The Sun Emblem organization appears to have preferred a specific type of composite panel that shows up in several of the spaces associated with them. The main administrative structures use a different material. The survivor modifications use whatever was available. Material archaeology, reading the history of a space through its materials, is something Ark Raiders supports with remarkable fidelity. The developers clearly thought about what materials would have been used where and why, and the consistency of their application allows attentive players to date and attribute spaces with reasonable confidence. There is a wall in the deep way station that is made of 3 distinct materials, each applied at a different time, each representing a different phase of the space's use. The original construction material, a reinforcement material applied later, a patch material applied more recently, 3 layers of material history in a single wall section, each one a response to a different circumstance. The patch material is unusual. It matches none of the materials used in the original construction or the reinforcement. It is a material found primarily in the areas associated with the Sun Emblem organization, which means the most recent modification to this wall, the newest layer of this material history, was made by them. They were in the way station recently enough to be considered the most recent builders. Their material is on top of everything else. Whatever they did there, it was not in the distant past. Construction as storytelling is one of Ark Raiders' most understated techniques. The game never directs your attention to these details. There are no quests that tell you to analyze building materials. But the details are there, consistent and intentional, ready to reward exactly the kind of sustained attention that this video is built around. The buildings in Ark Raiders built to last are still standing, at least partially. The ones that were built quickly show more significant deterioration. The ones that were improvised post-collapse are the most fragile of all. Construction philosophy and structural integrity align in a way that feels morally neutral, but is quietly poetic. The things built with care lasted. The things built in haste didn't. There is a building in the Cascade region that has been reinforced so extensively that it shows almost no deterioration at all. From the exterior, it looks almost new. Its windows are intact. Its structure is sound. The reinforcement work done on it is extraordinary, far beyond what the building's apparent function would justify. This building is almost certainly more important than it appears. Something inside it was worth protecting to this degree. Something inside it may still be intact, preserved by all that careful reinforcement. What that something is, the game does not currently reveal. The building's interior is not accessible. The only entrance visible from the exterior has been sealed, from the inside, with a door that shows recent use. Recent use of a sealed entrance in a building that has been reinforced to extraordinary standards. There is something in there, something that someone wanted to preserve, something that someone may still be visiting. The built world of Ark Raiders is a record of priorities. Every structure tells you what its builders considered worth protecting, worth investing in, worth finishing. And the structures that received the most care are the ones connected, directly or indirectly, to the threads that run through this entire video. The signal post, the sun emblem, the sealed tunnels, the things that were meant to last. Whatever was being protected, whatever the elaborate construction, and the sealed entrances, and the marked routes, and the still transmitting signals are meant to preserve, it has been preserved. The buildings built to last are still standing, and inside the most carefully preserved of them, something is waiting. Chapter 7. What the children left. There is a category of environmental detail in Ark Raiders that is consistently the most affecting, the most quietly devastating, and the most carefully placed evidence of children. The game handles this category with restraint. It is not exploitative, it is not graphic. It is simply present in the way that the most honest kinds of presence are. The child's drawing found behind the shelving unit in Ironfield was mentioned in the first chapter. The single shoe in the common hall was mentioned in the chapter on the people who stayed. These are not isolated details. They are part of a larger pattern of child-specific evidence distributed throughout the game's environments. Children's handwriting appears in several locations, distinctive in its letter forms and in the specific kinds of errors children make when writing. A list in what appears to be a child's hand, found in the common hall, lists names. 6 names. Small names, some of them clearly nicknames. A group of children who knew each other. The names on the list do not appear anywhere else in the game. They are not on identification cards. They are not in any of the partial records visible in the administrative areas. They exist only on this list, in a child's handwriting, in the common hall. 6 children who were there, who were part of the community, whose names were written down, and who then, like everything else, stopped leaving traces. There is a corner of the common hall that has a lower ceiling than the rest of the space, created by a secondary structure built within the larger room. The lower ceiling area is small, accessible only to someone who crouches or to someone significantly shorter than an average adult. Inside this space, there are marks on the wall at the height a child would reach. Drawings, short texts. A game drawn on the floor with chalk. This was a children's space within the adult space. Someone built a room within a room, a smaller world within the larger world, so that children could have something of their own. That act of building, of making a smaller, more accessible space for children, while the larger space dealt with the weight of survival, is one of the most quietly moving construction decisions in the game. The chalk game drawn on the floor is partially legible. It follows the pattern of a game played by taking turns. The last move was made. The game was interrupted mid-play, not finished, just stopped. Like so many things in Ark Raiders, children's toys appear in several locations throughout the game, always placed with the same care as the shoe in the common hall. None of them are where you would expect to find children's toys in the ruins of civilization. They are not in the children's space in the common hall. They are in adult spaces, in work areas, in corridors, in places where an adult would have had them. Carried, held on to, the presence of children's toys in adult spaces is a specific kind of grief. These are objects that were kept by adults after the child who owned them was no longer present to need them. The objects were worth carrying. They were part of the minimum that a person needed to have with them. There is a workbench in the foundry where detailed calculations were being done, the workbench in the numbers chapter. Under the bench, in the corner, there is a small object. It is the size and rough shape of a toy animal. It is very hard to see, tucked into the shadow at the back of the corner. It was either left there by a child who visited the workspace or placed there by whoever was doing the calculations. The proximity of the child's toy to the wall of calculations, to all that mathematical work trying to find a way through, creates an emotional context for the numbers. The person doing the math was not just a technician working on an abstract problem. They were a parent, or someone who had known a child, someone for whom the small number at the end of the calculations had a personal meaning. Ark Raiders does not tell you this. The game never says, this person had a child, or this was someone's parent. The toy under the bench is just there, just a small object in a shadow, unremarked upon. But its placement is the game's equivalent of a whisper. Children's educational materials appear in several locations, including the improvised school mentioned in the first chapter. These materials cover practical skills consistent with the survival context, but among them in the school space there are also materials that are purely creative. Drawing materials, a musical instrument of the simplest kind, a recorder or similar. Things that serve no survival function. Someone decided that children, even in the worst circumstances, needed things that served no survival function. That decision was made deliberately in conditions of scarcity. The drawing materials and the musical instrument were not accidents, they were priorities. The musical instrument in the school space has been used. The wear on it is clear. Someone played it, or many people played it, enough to show in the material. Music was made in this space, in these circumstances. That is an insistence on beauty in conditions designed to eliminate beauty. There is graffiti in the children's section of the common hall that is different in tone from the graffiti found elsewhere in the game. Most graffiti in Ark Raiders is functional or melancholic, marking territory, documenting experiences, expressing despair or determination. The graffiti in the children's space is playful. There are drawings of imaginary animals. There are invented words. There is a sequence of coloured marks that appears to be purely decorative. Children's playfulness, persisting in the most difficult circumstances, is one of the things that the game's world builders seem to have wanted to honour. The playful graffiti is not treated differently from the functional graffiti. It is just there, part of the record. Children were here. They played. They invented things. They drew animals that do not exist. There is a name scratched into the wall near the entrance to the children's space. A single name at child height. Small letters, slightly uneven. A child scratched their name into the wall. I was here. I was real. This is my name. That name, that specific act of self-inscription by a specific child in a specific moment, is one of the clearest expressions of the game's central theme. The insistence on presence. The refusal to be erased. A child did what humans do when they want to be remembered. They put their name on the wall. The developmental evidence in Ark Raiders' environments traces a community that existed for long enough that children who were young when it was established grew up within it. The earliest child evidence, drawings and toys belongs to very young children. Later evidence, slightly more developed handwriting, more sophisticated drawings, the chalk game on the floor, suggests older children. The trajectory of that development spans years. This community lasted years. Children grew up in it. The world they grew up in was not the world their parents came from. It was this world, this underground, this improvised space with its common hall and its lower ceiling children's corner. This was their normal. What that means for how they understood the Ark, for what they knew about the world above, for what they hoped or feared or imagined, the game does not say. But the evidence of their growth, the developmental arc visible in the evidence they left, is its own form of statement. We grew up here. This was our home. There is a height chart on the wall of the children's space, marks at different heights, with dates next to each. Several children, tracked over time. The chart begins at one height, suggesting a starting age of around 4 or 5, and the highest marks on the chart extend to what would be approximately 10 or 11 years of age. About 6 years of records. The chart stops. The marks stop at a certain height. The dates stop. Whatever happened happened when the tallest child on the chart was approximately 10 or 11 years old. The chart is the clearest single piece of evidence in the game for how long the Waystation community lasted, and approximately, when it ended, 6 years at minimum. A child who was an infant when the community formed was 10 when it ended. That child grew up in this place. After the height chart, there are no more child traces in the way station. The community that maintained it, that built the children's space and the common hall and the improvised school, ended. And the children ended with it, or went somewhere else, or grew into adults who left different kinds of traces. There is one possible adult trace of the children in the way station community. Among the more recent environmental elements in the game, those that appear to post-date the main period of habitation, there is graffiti in a style that shares characteristics with the children's graffiti in the common hall. The rounded letter forms, the particular way the marks curve, a handwriting style that is consistent with what the more developed children's writing in the community might have grown into. This adult graffiti, if it is from the same individual, means someone from the way station community survived long enough to become an adult and continued to leave marks, continued the practice of inscription, continued to say in different places, in the same handwriting grown larger and more confident, "I am here. I was here." That thread, from the child's name scratched at child height in the children's corner to the adult graffiti in a later period, is the longest continuous human story the game tells. Not explicitly, not as a named character or a questline, just as a consistent style of handwriting, persisting through years. Chapter 8. The archive continues. Throughout this video, patterns have emerged and been followed, threads have been picked up and traced, and everything has pointed toward a world that is richer and more intentional than it first appears. The final chapter is about what all of it adds up to, not as a conclusion, because Ark Raiders does not offer conclusions, but as an orientation, a sense of where everything points. The most consistent thing about Ark Raiders' Easter eggs and environmental details is their direction. They do not simply depict the past, they point towards something that is still in progress. The tally marks at 271 suggest counting that may still be happening. The timer in the foundry is still running. The radio signals are still transmitting. The sealed walls were sealed from the inside. The Sun Emblem organization appears to be the most active, ongoing presence in the game's fiction. Their marks are the most recent. Their technology is the most recent layer on the walls. Their routes are still marked. Their signal post is overbuilt in a way that suggests intended long-term use. They were planning for something that has not happened yet. What they were planning is one of the game's central mysteries. The partial decipherment of their code gives fragments, locations, coded names, a project with an undercodable symbol for a name. The project has a name. Projects with names are real. They are being worked toward. They exist in time as goals that have not yet been achieved. The connection between the Sun Emblem organization and the non-standard Ark units is the thread that, if pulled, unravels the most about the game's larger story. If humans were modifying Ark units, they were doing so with intent. And the most likely intent, in the context of everything else the Sun Emblem organization appears to have been working toward, is influence, control, a way of affecting Ark behavior from within. Whether that project was ever successful, whether those 11 modified units behave differently, in any meaningful way, whether the modifications achieve their purpose, the game does not currently show. But the evidence of the attempt is there. Someone tried. Someone understood the machines well enough to get inside them and change something. The old signal post, overbuilt and pointed outward, was communicating with something at a distance. The frequency on the waystation console, locked in the moment before the clock stopped, was receiving a long-range signal. There is an elsewhere. There is something outside the game's current map that the people in the game were in contact with, and that the Sun Emblem organization was oriented toward. Players have noted that the behavioral patterns of Ark units at the northeastern edge of the map, near the signal post, are different from those elsewhere. Units there move differently. They are slightly more purposeful, slightly more directed. They are not patrolling. They are oriented. Something about the northeastern edge is significant to the arc. The same direction the tunnels were heading. The same direction the Sun Emblem organization's routes converged toward. The same direction the signal was being sent or received from. The northeastern edge of the map is where everything points. What is there? The game does not currently show. It is beyond the playable area, behind the wall, with the most arc traffic, somewhere that the sealed tunnels were heading before they were stopped or sealed. It is the next chapter in a story that has been building across every detail, every mark, every number, every piece of child's writing, every weld and patch and sealed door. The archive of Ark Raider's world is not complete. The game is ongoing. The things discovered and catalogued and discussed in this video are the record as it stands today. New content will add to it. New regions will open. New details will emerge that recontextualize the ones already found. That is the nature of an archive that is still being added to. It is also, not coincidentally, the nature of the world the game depicts. A world whose record is still being made. People are still writing on the walls. Someone is still leaving marks. Someone from the Way Station community's children's corner, with their distinctive rounded letter forms, is still writing their name in new places. The Easter eggs and details in Ark Raiders are not decorations. They are the game's argument about what civilization is and what it means for it to end, and what it means to keep going anyway. Every hidden detail is a piece of evidence for continuity. Every secret is an act of preservation. The developers made this game about extraction, about running and surviving and grabbing what you can before the machines get you. But underneath that game, in the walls and the floors and the numbers and the signals, they built a different kind of game. A game about what remains. A game about what people leave behind when they know they might not make it. A game about the stubbornness of evidence. 271 tally marks on a wall somewhere underground. 271. Someone counted that high. Someone kept going all the way to that number. And then they stopped, or they were stopped, or they ran out of wall. But the number is there. It persists. It will be there when players find it for the first time years from now, when the game has grown into something even larger than it is today. The counting is not over. Continue no matter what. 1924. Strategized expanding script with additional chapters and Easter eggs. Strategized expanding script with additional chapters and Easter eggs. Chapter 9. The Faction. No one named. There is a presence in Ark Raiders that does not belong to any of the named factions, does not carry any of the identified emblems, and does not leave the kind of organized, intentional traces that the Sun Emblem organization leaves. Instead, it leaves something messier, more urgent, more desperate. And yet, when you map its traces across the game's environments, a shape emerges that is just as deliberate as anything the Sun Emblem organization produced. Players have started calling this presence the unnamed for obvious reasons. The game offers no label for them. There is no emblem. There is no code to decipher. There are just patterns of behavior visible in the environment that suggest a group of people operating under very different constraints than any other identified faction. The unnamed appear to move fast. Their traces are in transit spaces, corridors, junctions, the kinds of areas you pass through on your way to somewhere else. They do not appear to have fixed bases, or, if they do, those bases have not been found. Their marks are always in passing places. The marks themselves are quick, scratched in seconds, rather than painted over minutes. They use a minimal visual vocabulary, simple shapes that convey status or direction, and they are placed at the height of someone moving without stopping. Someone who was passing through and needed to leave a mark without slowing down. Speed as a behavioral signature suggests threat. The unnamed were moving through these spaces in conditions where lingering was dangerous. They were not the dominant presence in any of the areas where their marks appear. They were passing through other people's territory, or through contested territory, or through spaces controlled by the Ark. Several of their marks appear in areas with heavy arc unit presence. These are not areas most players would choose to loiter in long enough to scratch a mark on a wall. Whoever left these marks was either extremely capable or extremely desperate, possibly both. The directional marks left by the unnamed are consistent. The same symbol used for the same purpose across different regions. This consistency suggests shared language, shared training, a group that established a communication system and used it reliably. They may not have had bases, but they had organization. What direction the marks point is interesting. They do not cluster toward the northeastern edge of the map, the way the sun emblem routes do. They point inward, toward the center of the game's current playable area, toward the most heavily occupied Ark territory. The unnamed were heading into the densest Ark presence, not away from it. They were going toward the machines on purpose. Players who have followed the directional marks as far as they can within the current map find that they converge on a location in the central region that has no obvious significance from a gameplay perspective. It is not a marked area. It is not resource-rich. There is no loot there. There is just a patch of ground that the unnamed's marks point toward, consistently, from multiple directions. At that location, if you look at the ground, there is a patch of disturbed earth. Not excavated, not collapsed, just disturbed, as if something was buried there, or dug up, or as if many people walked over the same spot over a period of time. The disturbed ground in the center of the map, the convergence point of the unnamed's directional marks, may be the closest thing the game currently has to marking the location of something that was taken or buried. Whether that thing is still there, whether the unnamed found it or left it, or were looking for it, the game leaves open. The relationship between the unnamed and the Sun Emblem organization is not made explicit, but the evidence suggests they were aware of each other. In one location where both groups' marks appear on the same wall, the unnamed's mark has been placed over the Sun Emblem organization's mark, partially obscuring it. Whether this was deliberate, whether it was a statement of some kind, is impossible to determine with certainty, but the overlap is curious. In all the game's environments, there are very few places where two different groups' marks appear on the same surface. Physical proximity of marks is relatively rare. That they chose the same wall in that specific location implies it was a significant location to both groups. The wall in question is adjacent to the sealed administrative filing cabinets, the ones with the welded drawers and the removed labels. Both the Sun Emblem organization and the unnamed left marks near those cabinets. Whatever is in those sealed drawers, both groups considered it worth marking. The unnamed's mark near the cabinets is different from their standard directional marks. It is a different shape entirely, something that has not been found anywhere else in the game. A unique mark used exactly once in the most significant location where the unnamed's presence has been identified. A unique mark used once in a specific location could be a name, or a declaration, or a warning. The game does not say. The mark is there, unrepeated, near the sealed cabinets that both factions cared about. Among the fastest traces left by the unnamed are what appear to be emergency messages, short strings of their minimal symbols that read, "Under the developing interpretive framework the community has built," as alerts or warnings. These are placed at junctions, at points where someone coming from one direction would encounter them before going further. The warnings appear to cluster in time based on their placement in the stratigraphy of the game's environmental layering. They were all left in approximately the same period. Something was happening that required widespread warning distribution, something the unnamed needed people to know about urgently. That period corresponds, in the game's rough temporal framework, to the period just after the moment marked by the stopped clocks. The unnamed were leaving warnings in the immediate aftermath of whatever the clocks mark. They were responding to it. They knew what it was. This makes them potentially the most direct witnesses to whatever the stopped clocks represent. If they were moving through the game's environments in the immediate aftermath, leaving urgent warnings. They were present and operational when it happened. They survived it, at least initially. Whether the unnamed survived beyond that immediate post-event period is unclear. Their marks thin out in the later environmental layers. The urgency of the warning period does not seem to have been followed by a period of stabilization and continued operation. They were very active, and then, like the scheduled community in the way station, they seem to have ended. Or they adapted. The marks thin out, but they do not fully stop. There is one mark in the deepest accessible portion of the way station's lower levels that appears in the most recent environmental layer. One mark from the unnamed, placed recently. Someone from that group was in the deepest part of the way station recently, the same deepest section where the old generation arc unit component is embedded in the wall, the same deepest section where the sealed tunnel ends on the inside. Someone from the unnamed was in that space, saw those things, and left their mark. What they thought about what they found there, the game does not say, but a single mark left by a group that otherwise appears to have gone silent in the most significant location in the game's underground is not nothing. It is a sign of continued existence. The unnamed are still here. The unnamed's minimal visual language, its economy and speed, contrasts sharply with the Sun Emblem organization's more elaborate communication system. But both systems are in use in the same world, serving different needs, reflecting different circumstances. The Sun Emblem organization had time and resources. The unnamed had neither. Different survival conditions produce different communication strategies. The unnamed system is built for mobility and danger. It is the communication system of people who cannot afford to stop. That is a story in itself, even without knowing who they are, or what they wanted, or where they came from. There is a personal item found in one of the transit spaces most heavily marked by the unnamed that belongs to neither the Sun Emblem organization nor any other identified faction. It is a small object, personal in scale, that shows heavy wear from extended carrying. It was dropped, or placed, in the middle of one of the unnamed's corridors. The object itself is ordinary enough, a piece of personal equipment of the kind that might have been carried by anyone in the game's world. But it has been modified. A small mark has been scratched onto it, the same mark used by the unnamed. This was someone's personal item. They marked it with their faction symbol. It meant something to them. Finding a marked personal item in the middle of a transit corridor suggests it was left intentionally, perhaps at a meeting point, perhaps as a signal, perhaps dropped in flight. The context does not fully determine the meaning, but the intentionality of the mark on the object suggests it was not simply lost. Someone left a marked personal item in a corridor used by their group, in a location surrounded by their directional marks. The most natural reading is that someone from the unnamed was communicating something to other members of their group, using an object as a marker. Here. I was here. Follow or do not follow, but I was here. The echo of still here, the message from the sealed container discussed in the People chapter, is not accidental. Arc Raiders keeps returning to this theme because the game is made by people who believe it matters. Presence, evidence of presence, the insistence on leaving a mark in a world that erases marks. The unnamed are part of that insistence. They may be mysterious, their name may be unknown, their goals may be undeciphered, but they were here. Their marks prove it. And one of them was in the deepest part of the way station recently, looking at the oldest arc unit fragment and the sealed tunnel entrance, and left a single mark to say, I saw this too. Chapter 10. Depth and Distance. The geography of Arc Raiders lore is not metaphorical. Depth and distance in the game's physical spaces correspond directly to depth and distance in its history. The further underground you go, the further back in time you reach. The further toward the edges of the map, the closer you get to the things that matter most. This is not an accident of level design. It is a system. Understanding the game's spatial logic makes everything else more legible. When you find something in the deepest accessible corridor of the way station, you know you're looking at something old. When you find something near the northeastern edge of the map, you know you are looking at something that connects to the game's most important, unresolved threads. The geography is the timeline. The surface regions of the game correspond to the most recent period of its history. The collapse is most visible there, most raw, most immediate. The buildings that collapsed most recently are on the surface. The most recent human traces, the freshest graffiti, the most recently disturbed surfaces are on the surface. As you descend, you move backward in time. The middle levels of the underground regions correspond to the period of organized survival. The common hall, the school, the height chart, the schedules, these are middle-level features. The deep levels correspond to the pre-collapse period and, in the deepest accessible spaces, to the period before what the game establishes as recent history. The old Arc unit component in the deepest accessible waystation corridor is the oldest legible artifact in the game. It is from a period so far before the game's present that the unit design has changed significantly. The design language of that embedded component is recognizable as Arc, but it belongs to an earlier iteration of Arc technology. This implies that the Arc's presence in the game's world predates what most players assume. The machines did not arrive with the crisis. They were here before. The deepest level of the game, the oldest layer of the spatial timeline, contains evidence that the Arc was present during a period the game depicts as normal human history. Whether the humans of that earlier period knew about the Arc component embedded in their wall, whether it was placed there or grew there or arrived in some other way, the game does not say. But it was there while the way station was being built, while the tunnels were being dug, while the communication infrastructure was being installed. The possibility that the entire built environment of Arc Raiders was constructed in the knowledge, on some level, of Arc presence changes how you look at everything. The overbuilt signal post, the redundant communication infrastructure, the reinforced walls, the sealed and welded and hidden things. Were these responses to the Arc or precautions against something people had always known was there? Distance from the center of the map corresponds to significance in a different way. The most gameplay-relevant content is centrally located. The lore-relevant content is peripheral. This is a design choice that respects the player's time in the main game loop, while rewarding those who push toward the edges. The furthest accessible point of the game's current map, in any direction, contains something of note. In the east, there is a viewpoint from which a structure is visible in the distance, beyond the playable area, that does not correspond to anything in the game's existing architecture vocabulary. It is different enough in design that it reads as belonging to a different context entirely. In the west, the furthest accessible point opens onto what appears to be a much larger exterior space, only partially visible, with signs of recent human activity visible near the boundary of the playable area. Someone is active just beyond where the game allows players to go. In the south, the furthest accessible point is a collapsed tunnel entrance that matches the construction style of the newest tunnel sections, the ones heading northeast. This tunnel was part of the same expansion project, heading in a different direction. Where this branch was going, and whether it reached its destination before it collapsed, the current content does not answer. The north remains the most closed of the cardinal directions. The northern boundary of the map is a sheer structural wall with no visible openings. There are no marks on it, no modifications, no signs of attempted passage. Of all the map's edges, the north is the most final. Whatever is beyond it was either unreachable from this direction or was sealed so thoroughly that no trace of the ceiling remains. The vertical dimension of the game's spatial system extends in both directions. You can go down into history. But there is also an up dimension, accessible in a few specific locations, that follows its own logic. Height in the game corresponds not to the past, but to visibility and surveillance. The high points of the game's structures are observation points, watching positions, places built to see. The highest accessible point in the current game is a platform near the top of a structure in the Foundry region. From there, on a clear in-game day, the extent of the playable area is visible, and at its edges, the structures and spaces that mark the boundaries of what is currently explorable can be seen in their totality for the first time. The map makes sense from up there. You can see how the pieces relate. You can also see from that high point that the northeastern section of the map is visually different from the rest. Something there catches the light differently. The surface texture is unlike anything else visible from above. The game's rendering is doing something there that it is not doing anywhere else in the currently accessible area. Whatever that surface difference represents, it was built into the game deliberately. The visual distinction of the northeastern area is not a rendering artifact. It is a design choice. It is meant to look different. It is meant to be noticed from the one place in the game where you can see far enough to notice it. Players who have reached the high point in the Foundry and look toward the northeast have documented the visual difference consistently. It is real. It is there every session. Something about that area is marked in the game's visual language as significant, as other, as belonging to a different category than the rest of the map. The spatial logic of Ark Raiders rewards players who think about geography as language. Where things are located tells you something about what they mean. Depth means age. Distance from center means significance. Height means surveillance. The northeastern edge means destination. There is a map fragment separate from the hand-drawn map found in the ventilation shaft that was found by a player who explored outside the normal play paths in the Ironfield district. This fragment shows a portion of the game's geography from a different perspective, as if drawn by someone who viewed the area from above. An aerial perspective. The aerial map marks several locations with the same symbol, a small spiral that does not appear in any other context in the game. 4 spirals placed at 4 specific points in the geography visible on the fragment. The spirals are distributed in a pattern that, if you overlay the fragment on the game's actual map, places them at roughly equal distances from the northeastern edge. 4 markers at equal distances from a destination. These could be waypoints, stages of a journey, points where something is stored or hidden or accessible. The 4 spiral locations on the map correspond to areas in the game that have, when examined closely, unusual features that were not previously explained. The first spiral location has a section of floor that is slightly elevated, as if something is stored beneath it. The second has a wall that echoes differently from adjacent walls when subjected to in-game environmental audio. The third has a concentration of the Sun Emblem organization's most recent material on its surfaces. The fourth has one of the unnamed's directional marks pointing directly toward the northeastern edge. 4 points, each with a different kind of significance, each associated with different threads in the game's lore, each equidistant from the northeastern edge. The spiral map was connecting them. Whoever drew it was tracking multiple threads at once. Depth and distance, the vertical and horizontal axes of the game's spatial meaning system, intersect in one specific location. The sealed tunnel entrance in the deepest accessible way station corridor, heading northeast. Going down takes you back in time. Going toward the northeast takes you toward the destination. The sealed tunnel does both simultaneously. It is the game's spatial and narrative convergence point, tucked in its deepest, most history-laden corner, pointing toward its most significant geographic direction. That tunnel was sealed from the inside. Someone went through it and sealed it behind them. They went down and forward simultaneously, into the oldest space and toward the most significant destination, and they are still on the other side of that seal. The spatial logic of Ark Raiders places that tunnel at the intersection of the game's 2 most important axes. Its depth says, this is as far back as you can go. Its direction says, this is the way to what matters most. Together, they say, here is the threshold. Here is where everything the game is building toward begins. The archive is still being assembled. The distances are still being measured, the depths are still being explored, and somewhere past the sealed wall at the bottom of the most historically layered corridor in the game, the story that all of these details have been building toward is continuing without us. For now, continue no matter what, 1934. Resolved to sustain creative momentum throughout script continuation. Resolved to sustain creative momentum throughout script continuation. Chapter 11. The language of damage. Every surface in Arc Raiders has been damaged in some way. That is the baseline condition of the game's world. Damage is everywhere, constant, unremarkable. But not all damage is the same, and the game's artists and designers made deliberate choices about what kind of damage appears where, and what caused it, and how old it is. Reading damage as a language gives you another layer of history to work with. There are three broad categories of damage, visible throughout the game's environments. The first is structural damage, the kind caused by weight, age, seismic activity, or catastrophic events. Collapsed ceilings, buckled floors, cracked walls. This damage is slow and impersonal. It is what happens to buildings when nobody is maintaining them. The second category is impact damage, the kind caused by force applied quickly. Dents, penetrations, blast patterns, scorch marks. This damage is faster and more specific. It has a direction and a source. You can often tell where the impact came from and with what. The third category is the most interesting. Intentional damage. Damage that was caused by humans deliberately, for a purpose. Cut marks, controlled burns, removed sections, things that were broken on purpose. The intentional damage in Arc Raiders is distributed in ways that tell stories. There are sections of wall that have been deliberately opened and then resealed. There are pipes that have been cut and then capped. There are structural elements that have been partially removed in ways that suggest careful, targeted work rather than destruction or accident. This intentional damage is the physical record of decisions. Someone decided to open that wall. Someone decided to cut that pipe. The reasons behind those decisions are often not obvious, but the decisions themselves are visible, and they cluster in ways that reveal priorities. The most concentrated area of intentional damage in the game is the administrative section of the way station. This is also where the sealed filing cabinets are, where the marks of both the Sun Emblem organization and the unnamed appear, and where the Arc unit was frozen mid-motion, heading toward. The administrative section has been more deliberately modified than any other comparable space in the game. Walls have been opened and resealed multiple times, based on the layering of different repair materials visible at the edges of the cuts. Different groups, at different times, were accessing the space behind those walls. The space behind the walls in the administrative section is a utility corridor, narrow and functional, that runs the length of the administrative block. The utility corridor itself shows signs of use, not just passage but habitation, or at least extended occupation. There are marks on the floor from repeated foot traffic. There are small personal items tucked into corners. There is a section of wall in the utility corridor that has been used as a writing surface, covered in notes and calculations, and notably, a partial copy of the Sun Emblem organization's coded communication system. Someone was working on deciphering the code from inside the utility corridor. They had enough material to work from that they could copy significant portions of it onto the wall. They were not the original users of the code. They were studying it from the outside, trying to understand it. The notes surrounding the partial code copy suggest they were making progress. Several character correspondences are marked with what looks like confidence, and in the margin of the coded section, there is a word written in standard script, circled, that appears to be a translation of one of the code's most frequently recurring symbols. The word is not legible at normal play resolution, but players who have gotten as close as the engine allows report that it appears to be a word meaning something like beneath or below or under. The most frequently recurring symbol in the Sun Emblem organization's code translates to something meaning below. Whatever they were communicating about most frequently, it was something below, underground, beneath something. The tunnels, the deep way station, the sealed entrance. Impact damage tells different stories depending on its pattern. Blast damage radiates outward from a central point. Projectile damage travels in a line. Arc unit attack patterns are distinctive enough that players have learned to recognize them and distinguish them from human-caused impact damage. There are several locations in the game where the impact damage patterns are ambiguous, where the signature is neither clearly arc nor clearly human, but somewhere between. These ambiguous damage patterns appear in areas associated with the non-standard arc units, the ones with Sun Emblem organization connections and anomalous internal components. The ambiguous damage patterns are consistent with what you might expect from a machine that has been modified by human intervention. Not fully arc behavior, not fully human behavior, something hybrid. Whether these damage sites represent conflicts between modified arc units and standard arc units, or between modified arc units and humans, or something else entirely, the patterns alone cannot determine, but their concentration in areas of established Sun Emblem organization activity is not coincidental. Scorch marks in arc raiders carry temporal information. Fresh scorch marks retain color and texture that older scorch marks lose over time. The game renders this distinction carefully, and tracking the age of scorch marks against the established timeline of events provides another layer of dating for the game's history. The oldest scorch marks in the game, found in the deepest sections of the underground, are from a period that predates the organized survival communities. They correspond to the early Arc Presence period, the time when the old generation component was embedded in the way station wall. Something was burning in the deep underground a very long time ago. The most recent scorch marks, the freshest rendered damage in the game, are located near the entrance to the sealed tunnel in the deep way station. Something burned there recently. Whatever happened when the tunnel was sealed from the inside, it involved fire or extreme heat. The sealed entrance is surrounded by the freshest thermal damage in the game. Thermal damage from arc unit systems has a specific visual signature in the game, a particular color gradient, and edge quality that the artists established and maintained consistently. The thermal damage around the sealed tunnel entrance does not match that signature. It matches human-sourced thermal damage. The person who went through that tunnel and sealed it behind them used fire or extreme heat to accomplish the sealing. They burned their way in or burned their way sealed. That is not a small undertaking. That is a committed permanent act. Water damage is another readable form of damage in the game's environments. Staining, warping, and mineral deposits from water movement create patterns that indicate where water has been and for how long. In the underground regions, water damage is extensive and tells a story about the history of the underground water table. There are areas where water damage is unexpectedly absent, spaces that, given their depth and their proximity to water-damaged adjacent areas, should show water infiltration, but do not. These dry spaces either have waterproofing that is held or have some other reason for remaining dry. The driest space in the deepest accessible section of the way station is the area immediately surrounding the sealed tunnel entrance. Despite being the deepest accessible point, surrounded on multiple sides by significantly water-damaged areas, it is dry, almost perfectly dry. This dry zone around the sealed tunnel entrance implies either extraordinary waterproofing or something else maintaining the dryness, something active, something that has been keeping that space dry since before the current era of human habitation. Active waterproofing of an underground space requires either continuous mechanical intervention or a material that is inherently waterproof. Arc unit construction uses materials with exactly those properties. The dry zone around the sealed tunnel is consistent with an arc constructed or arc modified space. If the sealed tunnel entrance opens onto an arc constructed space, then whoever went through it and sealed it behind them went into arc territory. Not contested territory, not human-modified territory. Arc space, built by Arc to Arc specifications for Arc purposes. That person went into the machine world and sealed the door. The damage language of Arc raiders reaches its most complex expression in the common hall and the surrounding social spaces of the way station. Here, damage is layered with use and with maintenance, with attempts to repair and with the failure of those attempts. The space is neither simply ruined nor simply functional. It is both, in different proportions, in different sections, and the proportions tell you about how long the community lasted and how its circumstances changed over time. The early sections of the common hall show both damage and active maintenance. Damage was occurring and being addressed. The community had the capacity to repair. Later sections show damage being worked around rather than repaired. Damage was occurring faster than it could be addressed, and the latest sections show damage that was simply accepted. The community had stopped trying to keep up. This trajectory, from repair to workaround to acceptance, is the arc of a community under increasing stress. The common hall's damage pattern is a timeline of decline, written in cracked plaster and sagging supports and surfaces that were once tended and are now just deteriorating. And yet, even in the latest, most deteriorated sections, there are marks, writing on walls, objects placed with care, the children's marks, and the adult marks, and the height chart. People kept making marks even as the capacity for maintenance failed. The inscription instinct outlasted the repair instinct. The desire to be remembered outlasted the ability to fix things. That is the language of damage at its most eloquent. Not the damage itself, but what persisted alongside it. The marks kept being made, the counting kept happening. Right up to the end, and possibly past it, people were writing on the walls of a space they could no longer keep standing. Chapter 12. Secondary sources. Not everything in Arc Raiders lore comes from direct environmental evidence. Some of the game's most interesting details emerge from indirect sources, from what other things imply, from the negative space of what is absent, and from the formal properties of the game itself as a designed artifact. The loading screen text fragments are one of the game's most underappreciated lore sources. Brief, seemingly incidental, they rotate through a large pool of entries that most players read once and then stop noticing. But read as a corpus, as a collected body of text rather than isolated fragments, they tell a coherent story. The loading screen texts fall into several categories. Some are descriptive, contextual notes about the game's world. Some are instructional, in-universe guidance for Arc Raiders operatives. Some are clearly in-universe advertising or propaganda from the pre-collapse period, fragments of a commercial or institutional voice that no longer exists. And some are personal, first-person fragments that read like diary entries or letters. The personal fragments are the most narratively rich. They appear to come from multiple different voices, identifiable by their distinct tones and the specific details they reference. One voice is clearly technical, focused on systems and data. One is observational, noting details of the game's world with a journalist's eye. One is emotional, processing fear and loss in real time. The emotional voice in the loading screen texts uses a distinctive phrase construction that appears in one piece of environmental writing, specifically in the utility corridor behind the administrative block wall. The person who is working on the code decipherment, the person studying the Sun emblem organization from inside the walls, may be the same person whose voice appears in the loading screen texts. If that connection is valid, then the loading screen texts provide a rare window into a specific individual's experience and perspective. Someone who was curious and frightened and determined in equal measure. Someone who was trying to understand things that were actively dangerous to understand. The technical voice in the loading screen text references systems and data that partially match the behavioral diagrams found on the Foundry workbench wall. The person with the technical voice may have been associated with or familiar with the workbench work, the study of arc unit behavior and decision-making. The observational voice is the hardest to place. Its descriptions do not match any specific location in the game's current content with certainty, but the locations it describes are consistent with the kind of places that would be visible from the sealed tunnel's destination. Wherever that voice was writing from, it was somewhere the current game does not show. The absence of certain types of content in the loading screen texts is also informative. There are no texts that directly address the Sun Emblem organization by any name or identifier. There are no texts that explicitly describe the non-standard arc units. There are no texts that mention the old signal post. These absences are too consistent to be accidental. Someone curated the loading screen texts. Someone decided what would and would not appear there. The categories of content that are systematically absent from the loading screen texts are exactly the categories most connected to the game's deepest secrets. Whoever assembled the loading screen texts wanted them to be informative, but not too informative. This implies that the loading screen texts are themselves an in-universe document, not a meta-narrative device, but an actual artifact produced by someone within the game's fiction who had reasons for what they included and what they left out. The Arc Raiders Operative Handbook, fragments of which appear in loading screens, and environmental text throughout the game, is another secondary source worth close attention. The handbook describes the Arc Raiders as an organization, outlines their operational procedures, and contextualizes their activities in relation to the game's broader setting. But the handbook is clearly incomplete. There are references to sections that are not shown, mentions of protocols that are never elaborated, a table of contents fragment that lists chapters whose content does not appear anywhere in the current game. The handbook as presented is excerpted, and the excerpts were chosen carefully. The chapters whose content is absent from the handbook excerpts correspond in subject matter to exactly the areas most connected to the game's deepest lore. There is an absent chapter on previous survivor organizations, an absent chapter on pre-collapse arc research, an absent chapter on deep infrastructure. The handbook knows more than it shows, and the knowledge it withholds is organized around exactly the same secrets the environmental evidence points toward. Secondary sources in Arc Raiders often reflect on each other. The loading screen texts, the handbook, the environmental writing, and the audio logs, few as they are, create a network of mutual reference that confirms and complicates each other in productive ways. No single source is complete, no single source is fully reliable. Together, they are more than the sum of their parts. There is a game mechanic that functions as a lore source that is often overlooked because it is so thoroughly integrated into normal gameplay. The behavior of arc units in different areas encodes information about those areas. Units in areas associated with the Sun Emblem organization behave differently from units in areas without that association. Units near the sealed tunnel entrance behave differently again. Near the sealed tunnel entrance, arc units do something that they do nowhere else in the game. They pause. Briefly, barely noticeably, they pause in their movement when they pass within a certain radius of the sealed entrance. Not for long, not consistently enough to be a gameplay mechanic, but consistently enough to be observed and documented by attentive players. They pause as if acknowledging something, as if recognizing a location. Whatever is on the other side of that sealed entrance, arc units know it is there. They register its presence as they pass. They pause. That behavioral detail, that micro-pause in machine movement near the game's most significant sealed location, is a secondary source. The machines are telling you something about that place. The game communicates lore through behavior, not just through text and environment. The pause behavior of the non-standard arc units near the sealed entrance is longer than that of standard units. If the non-standard units are partially under human influence, and if that influence is connected to the sun emblem organization and to whatever is past the sealed entrance, then the longer pause makes a kind of sense. These units have a stronger connection to that location. Their relationship to it is different. Audio behavior is another secondary source. The ambient sound design of different areas encodes emotional and narrative information. Areas associated with the sun emblem organization have a slightly different audio signature than other areas. Not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent. The mix of ambient frequencies is calibrated differently. Players who have analysed the audio profiles of different game regions note that the deep way station, particularly around the sealed tunnel entrance, has the most unusual audio profile in the game. It is quieter than adjacent areas in ways that are not explained by the physical dimensions of the space. Something is absorbing sound in that area, or something is producing a counter-frequency that quiets the ambient noise. Either explanation is notable. The quietest point in the game's audio design is the threshold of the sealed tunnel. Right at the seal itself, the game's sound design falls nearly silent there, which is not a technical artifact but a deliberate choice. The quietest place in the game is also the most significant physical location in the game's lore. Sound design as lore source, marking importance through absence of noise. There are player behaviors that function as indirect lore sources. The things players do in the game, the routes they take, the areas they avoid, the locations they return to. These are data about what the game communicates, even without explicit content. Where players pause and look around is a map of the game's emotional and narrative weight. The community of Ark Raiders players has documented their own behaviours extensively, and the patterns are revealing. Players consistently pause at the child's shoe in the common hall. They consistently stop at the frozen Ark unit in the Ironfield corridor. They consistently spend time at the mural sequence in the foundry. These are the game's emotionally heaviest moments, identified not by any formal designation, but by the consistent behaviour of thousands of players encountering them independently. That collective behaviour is a secondary source for the game's lore in a different sense. It is evidence of what the game is actually communicating, regardless of what any individual detail technically contains. The emotional weight that accumulates at those specific locations tells you about the design intent behind them, and about the themes the developers were most committed to expressing. The most visited non-gameplay location in the game, based on community documentation, is the children's space in the common hall. Players go there, spend time, and come back. The game has no reason to send players there. There is nothing to do there, but people go. That is the most powerful secondary source of all. Not what the game says, but what players do in response to what the game says. Chapter 13. What has not been found? Every Easter egg video is partly a video about what has been found. This one is also partly a video about what has not been found yet, because in Ark Raiders, the unfound is as meaningful as the found. There are spaces in the game's environments that show evidence of content that should exist but does not. Hooks with nothing hanging on them in a space that has clearly been used for storage. A frame on a wall with nothing in it. A shelf with clear space where something was and is no longer. These absences are too specific to be the result of developmental oversight. They are deliberate. They indicate that something was there and is no longer, either taken by in-world actors or removed from the game's content deliberately by the developers. The empty frame on the wall in the administrative section of the way station is the most discussed absence in the game. The frame itself is intact, well made, positioned with obvious intention at the centre of a wall in a space that was clearly significant. Whatever was in the frame was the focal point of the room, and it is gone. Players have speculated extensively about what was in the frame. A map is the most common theory. A portrait is another. Something official based on the quality and positioning of the frame. Something important enough to be removed rather than left. Whether it was removed by an in-world actor, someone who decided the frame's contents should not remain where they were, or whether it represents content that the developers plan to add later, the empty frame is a guarantee that something is coming. Either the in-world story of what happened to the frame's contents will be told, or the frame will eventually contain something. The sealed filing cabinets are another category of absence. What they contain has been deliberately made inaccessible. This is different from content that simply is not there. The cabinets actively prevent access to their contents. The contents exist within the game's fiction, sealed behind welded metal. They are present as absence. This distinction between things that are gone and things that are sealed is important in Ark Raider's lore framework. Gone things represent the past, things that happened, things that were taken away by events. Sealed things represent the ongoing present. They are still there. They are actively kept from view. The sealed things in Ark Raiders are the game's promises. The welded cabinets, the sealed tunnel, the reinforced building with recent door use, the active timer counting down to an event. These are all structures of anticipation. The game has built the locks before it has shown you what they protect. There are rooms in the game that are marked on no map and signposted by nothing, that players have found by exploring off-path areas extensively. Most of these rooms contain nothing of gameplay significance. Some contain nothing at all, but their existence off the beaten path, not directed by any game system, suggests that the development team built spaces for purposes that may not yet be apparent. One such room, found in the deep Ironfield district behind a damaged section of structural wall that requires specific navigation to pass through, is completely empty except for a single overhead light that is functioning. Every other light in the area is dark. This one light is on, as if someone just left, as if the room is still in use. An active light in an abandoned building is immediately notable. Power is not reliably available in the game's environments. Functional lights are rare. A single functioning light in an otherwise dark region, in an otherwise empty room, is the game saying, pay attention to this space. Whatever this room is for, whatever it will contain or has contained or will become, the active light marks it as significant. The light has been on across every session players have visited it. It does not flicker, it does not fail, it is simply on. There are audio events in Ark Raiders that players have reported but that are not consistently reproducible. Sounds heard in specific locations under specific circumstances that have no obvious source and do not match any documented game audio asset. These include a repeated soft sound in the deep way station that several players have described as footsteps, and an intermittent sound near the old signal post that has been described variously as breathing, as a low mechanical hum, and as something else entirely that players struggle to categorize. These audio reports are difficult to assess. Non-reproducible audio events could be environmental audio variations, edge cases in the game's procedural sound system, or something deliberate that has not been fully mapped. The community has not yet reached consensus on whether they represent genuine lore content or audio artifacts, but the consistency of reports from multiple players in the same locations keeps them in the conversation. When multiple unconnected players describe the same unusual audio in the same specific location, it is harder to dismiss as imagination or artifact. Something is being heard. There are symbols in the game's environment that have not yet been successfully interpreted. Beyond the Sun Emblem organization's code, beyond the Unnamed's minimal marking system, there are isolated symbols that do not fit into either framework and have not been connected to any other context. These may be from a third group, whose existence has not been fully established. They may be personal marks from individuals, not organizational systems. They may be developmental artifacts, design elements that were used during production and never fully removed from the final environment. Or they may be waiting for context that the game has not yet provided, symbols that will make sense when additional content adds the framework that explains them. The game's current content is not complete. Ark Raiders is ongoing. The developers are actively adding to it. Everything discussed in this video, every thread, every connection, every sealed door, an active light and unfound room exists within a game that is actively growing towards something. The unfound is not static. The space of the unknown is shrinking. Players who have been cataloguing environmental details from the game's earliest accessible versions have noted that the most recent content additions have consistently connected to threads that were established in early content without being developed. The developers are clearly working from a plan. The environmental details planted early are being paid off in later updates. This means the empty frame, the sealed cabinets, the running timer, the active light in the empty room, the quiet radio signals, the sealed tunnel with its recent thermal damage. All of these are scheduled. They are on a timeline. The answers are coming. What has not been found is not gone. It is forthcoming. The game is building toward it deliberately, with the same patience and consistency it used to build the world discussed in this video. The archive is incomplete because it is still being written. There is one category of unfound content that is especially interesting to think about. The content that may exist, but that the player community has simply not discovered yet. Not developmental content, not future additions, but things that are in the game right now, in the current build, that nobody has seen. Ark Raiders is a large game with an enormous playable space. The population of players engaged in systematic lore exploration is relatively small. The probability that every meaningful environmental detail in the current game has been found and catalogued is low. Somewhere in the game's current build, there are almost certainly details that would recontextualize things discussed in this video. Connections that would resolve ambiguities, marks that would fill in gaps, a detail in a dark corner of a room that no player has yet thought to look in closely. The unfound is not just the future, it is also the present, distributed across the game's enormous world, waiting for the right eyes and the right patience. That thought, the idea that something meaningful is sitting undiscovered in the game right now, is both humbling and exciting. This video is not a complete picture. No video could be a complete picture of Ark Raiders' Easter eggs and lore, because the picture is not finished. And some of it is already there, in the game, unlit, unnoticed, waiting. Chapter 14, The Recurring Details. Across Ark Raiders' environments, certain details appear again and again, in different forms, in different contexts, always carrying weight. These recurring details are not repetition for its own sake. They are the game's thematic vocabulary, the small set of images and ideas that it returns to because they are central to what it is saying. Fire is one of them. The game's world is full of evidence of fire. Old fires, recent fires, controlled burns and catastrophic ones. Fire in Ark Raiders is always meaningful. It is always a human act, almost always intentional, and it is always a marker of a significant moment. The fires in the game's history fall into two categories: fires of destruction, used to erase or deny, fires of warmth, used to survive and gather. The fire in the common hall's central hearth is a survival fire, used over a long period by a community trying to keep going. The fires in the administrative areas, the burned documents, the thermal sealing of the tunnel entrance, are erasure fires. Both kinds of fire are evidence of urgency. You burn things, warmth or destruction, when stakes are high. The distribution of fire evidence across the game's environments is a map of the moments when stakes were highest. Water is another recurring element. The game's world retains water in unexpected places, small accumulations in deep spaces, puddles that should have dried but have not. water that appears in the game's environmental rendering, to be moving slowly in places where there should be no water movement. Water in the game often appears in proximity to Arc unit activity or to the traces of Arc unit activity. The residue deposits mentioned in the machines chapter are sometimes wet, which implies active moisture in their vicinity. This could be a coincidence of the underground water table. It could also mean something about the Arc units themselves, about what their presence does to the environment at a micro-environmental level. Light behaves unusually in certain areas of Arc Raiders, not dramatically, not in ways that most players would notice during normal play. But attentive observation of the game's lighting reveals areas where light behaves differently than the environmental conditions would predict. Areas that are brighter than they should be, given the light sources present. Areas where the shadow behavior is inconsistent. The areas with unusual light behavior cluster around the same locations as other anomalous details. The Sun Emblem organization spaces, the unnamed Convergence point, the sealed tunnel area. The light anomalies are another layer of the game marking the same significant locations through different sensory channels simultaneously. The number 3 appears frequently in Arc Raiders' environmental details, not as a specifically significant number in the way that some of the numerical details discussed earlier are, but as a structural organizing principle. Things come in threes. 3 emblem types on identification cards, 3 mural panels before the unfinished 4th, 3 layers of material in the administrative wall, 3 distinct graffiti styles. This is partly a design principle with deep roots in human storytelling and visual culture, but in Arc Raiders, it is consistent enough to feel deliberate and specific. When you find 2 of something in the game, you should expect a 3rd, and when you find 3, you should ask whether the 4th, like the 4th mural panel, is unfinished. Hands appear in the game's visual environment more than you might expect. Not dramatically, not in a way that most players would register consciously, but there are handprints, hand marks, hand-shaped impressions, in dust or in material throughout the game. Human hands, specific individuals touching surfaces. A handprint is the most direct form of human presence, more immediate than a written mark, more personal than an arranged object. You cannot make a handprint without being physically present. It is the record of a specific body in a specific place at a specific moment. The handprints in Arc Raiders vary in size and condition. Some are large adult hands, some are smaller. One is very small, the size of a young child's hand, pressed flat against a wall in the children's space of the common hall, placed deliberately. A child pressing their palm flat against the wall, leaving their mark. I was here, and this is the exact size and shape of my hand. That child's handprint is the most personal mark in the game. More personal than a name. The name is a representation. The handprint is a direct record. That specific hand, that specific size, that specific spread of fingers, pressed against that wall in that moment. The handprint is at the height where a child standing on tiptoe might reach. They stretched as high as they could. They wanted to reach as high as possible before pressing their palm to the wall. As if height mattered. As if the mark would mean more if it was placed as high as they could manage. It does mean more. Everything about that detail is perfect. The recurring details in Arc Raiders are not accidental. They are the game's habits of thought, the images it returns to because the people who made it were thinking hard about specific things, and those things kept showing up in the work. Fire and water and light and numbers and hands. The material facts of human presence and human action. These details recur because the game is, at its core, about human presence, in a world that is hostile to human presence. The machines, the collapse, the darkness, the scarcity, all of it is a pressure against human presence. And the humans in the game's fiction responded to that pressure by insisting, repeatedly, obsessively, in every medium available to them. We are here. We were here. This is what our hands look like. The recurring details are the game's argument made visible, not in any single dramatic statement, but in the accumulation of small, repeated, insistent marks. Fire was here, water is here, a child's hand was here, reaching as high as it could, pressing its exact shape into the wall. That is what civilization is, reduced to its most essential form. The record of presence. The insistence that it happened, that people were real, that their specific size and shape and warmth left a mark that cannot be taken away. Chapter 15. The story. The game is telling. Ark Raiders is telling a story that it will never tell you directly. It is a story told in margins, in residue, in the things that happen to materials over time. It is a story about what it means to build something, in the knowledge that it might not last, and about what those things mean to the people who built them, and about what remains when those people are gone. The game's extraction loop, the run and survive mechanic, is not separate from this story. It is the story's present tense. Every time a player enters the world of Ark Raiders, they're doing what the game's human characters did. Moving through hostile space, looking for what matters, trying to get out before the machines find them. The player is not an observer of the game's story. They are its most recent chapter. The Easter eggs and environmental details discussed across this video are not decorations applied to the surface of a game about extraction. They are the game's argument that extraction has stakes, that the world being moved through is not empty, that every space has a history and every history has a human weight. The Sun Emblem organization, with its coded communications and its overbuilt signal post and its modified arc units and its sealed tunnel, represents an attempt to understand the crisis at its root level. These were people who refused to accept the collapse as an end state. They were working towards something. They had a plan with a name. The unnamed, with their quick marks and their convergence on the central disturbed ground, and their single recent mark in the deepest way station corridor, represent a different kind of response. More urgent, less organized, but equally committed. They were moving through the world at high speed, heading toward the most dangerous spaces, carrying something that mattered enough to mark with their faction symbol. The communities, the way station households, with their schedules and their common hall and their children, represent the most human response of all. They built normal life in abnormal conditions. They assigned teachers, they made schedules, they built a small room for children within the large room for adults. They created the conditions for people to grow up, even in a world that was trying to prevent it. All three responses, the organized investigation of the Sun Emblem organization, the urgent action of the unnamed, and the community building of the household groups, coexisted. They overlapped in space and time. They left marks on the same walls. They sealed the same cabinets. They all ended, or they all changed in ways that produced different kinds of evidence during the same period marked by the stopped clocks. Whatever the clocks mark, it transformed all three responses simultaneously. It is the pivot point of the game's hidden story. Before the pivot, three different human projects were ongoing. After the pivot, what remained was traces and silence, and one active light in an empty room and a timer still counting. The game's present day, the setting in which players operate, is after the pivot. Players are operating in the aftermath of something, the details of which the game has hidden throughout its environment, in fragments that require hundreds of hours of collective investigation to begin to assemble. The story being told is about what happened before, during, and potentially still in the wake of that pivotal moment. It is about what the Sun Emblem organization was building toward and whether they reached it. It is about who the unnamed were and what they found at the convergence point. It is about where the children went when the height chart stopped being updated. It is also about what the Ark is really, and how long it has been here, and whether it arrived or whether it was always here in some form, embedded in the oldest walls of the oldest structures. The old generation component in the deep way station corridor is the game's most troubling detail. The machines were here before the crisis. The crisis did not bring them. Something else called them, or woke them, or gave them new instructions. The sealed tunnel leads toward an answer to that question. Whoever went through it and sealed it behind them was going somewhere that would tell them something. The thermal damage on the seal is fresh enough to place the sealing event within the recent period. Someone crossed that threshold not long ago. They are still on the other side. The story the game is telling is not finished. It cannot be finished in a video, or in a series of videos, or by any single analyst working from current content. It will be finished in the game itself. Over time, as new content adds new layers, as sealed doors open, as the timer reaches 0, as the active light in the empty room acquires a context. But the story is being told now, in the current game, in every detail discussed across these chapters, and the shape of it is already visible. A world that built and maintained and documented itself with desperate thoroughness